Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good morning and welcome to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee. Can I just quickly first ask everyone to make sure your electronic devices are turned to silent mode to avoid any interruptions? And if I could then ask our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received.
Thank you, Chairman. No apologies for absence today.
Excellent. And declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Nope. Excellent. Okay, so we now turn to our main item for this morning, which is a discussion of the Greater London Authority 2024-25 Group Budget. So if I could welcome our two guests this morning. We have Enver, who is the Interim Chief Finance Officer at the GLA. Morning, Enver. And Elliott Ball, who is the Interim Assistant Director of Finance and Governance at the GLA. Morning, Elliott. So I will kick off with a sort of broad question, really. Thinking about inflation, obviously that's been one of the big financial stories for the last year or more, really. How have high inflation rates impacted the planning and the work on the new draft budgets? Obviously not just within the GLA, but across the GLA group.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Assembly members. The inflation is still impacting. Based on the submissions that we've had so far, there's just in excess of £500 million that have been baked into the submissions for inflation. It's broadly 50-50 between pay and non-pay, probably more on the pay than the non-pay side. That's what's been baked in. In addition to that, you would have heard at your committee yesterday that there are inflationary factors that are impacting on the housing industry, and therefore those are not in our budgets, but they impact on us. Inflation is significantly impacting on the boroughs that we work with, and so consequently it impacts the services that they can afford and they can provide. So broadly, that's our our broad position at the moment. It's there. We've done some factoring in. We benefit slightly because high interest then also means we get better rates of return on our investments, which sort of goes some way towards covering some of these costs. But on the whole, we have to find, for example, in the group, at least £500 million just to stand still.
Okay, and obviously there's quite a big difference between, let's say, inflation that's touching double digits and inflation that's more like, say, 4%. So we've seen that dip down. Is that looking like, well, I suppose there are two questions. One is it looking like more back on the lower, more normal rates of inflation? And what is there a sort of tail, a lagging tail effect of the period of very high inflation that we're still dealing with, or is that largely now moved through and we're just looking at sort of more 4%-ish?
I don't think it's moved through yet. When we were writing the budget guidance in July, well, we were drafting it in May, but when we published CPI was 8.7%. The government sets its allocations on the September figures, which were 6.7%, and I think the latest is 4.7 on CPI. So it's brilliant, it's going in the right direction. But what's already been baked into prices in the sector is the double-digit figures, and those have taken a while to get here. So everything's costing more, and I think it will take a while before the sort of true effect of, even if the actual interest rates drop down to 2%. I don't even know when that will be, but let's assume that it's as per the OBR forecast. It will take, I think, at least 12 months before, in budgeting terms, we get to see some of the benefits of that. By which time, prices don't go back to what they were. It'll be, if it's 2%, it'll be 2% onto whatever has been increased up till that moment. So I think the days of some of the prices that we've benefited from won't come back.
Understood. Okay. And other than inflation, are there other sort of wider macroeconomic outside forces that are, things that are outside of your control that are sort of driving the budget one way or the other?
Well, I think from a macro perspective, we're very reliant on the government, but the government has many, many priorities. It's supporting a war, still finding our way out of the pandemic, with London's recovery. There's a lot going on at a macro level, and we're reliant on supports, and our partners as well are reliant on support from similar sources. So that does have an impact, and the economy hasn't completely recovered, especially across the whole of the UK. And so consumer behaviour impacts on us and how that affects the high streets and businesses and business rates. So consequently, times are not feeling affluent at the moment, and that has an impact on public spending as well, because you have more people that need the public sector. You have more impact on homelessness, temporary housing, because people can't afford to pay their mortgages. These are all factors that, in a macroeconomic world, all of these things have a knock-on effect that then put pressure on public services, of which we're one organisation amongst many. So we're no different from others in terms of being hit by the impact of the public needing our services. But we work in partnership with boroughs, and you can see every day that, and I work very closely with the borough treasurers. They're facing some very significant issues, and that has an impact on us.
Understood. Okay, thank you, Enver. Next question from Assembly Member Harani.
Thank you, Chair. Just on some of that, just want to sort of dig a bit deeper, because on the GLA's London's economic outlook, it concluded that London's economic future remains uncertain because of the global and domestic crises that we see. You've already alluded to some of the challenges, but in terms of the GLA budget, what does this mean in actual real terms?
Do you mean in terms of spending power?
Yeah.
Do you know the answer to that? Because I think in real terms, I think we're worse off, because if you think of core spending power, for example, if you look at the latest policy statement, the government's increased 1%, but in real terms, that's actually that's a real terms reduction to local authorities, because if you're increasing core spending by 1% or 2% or 3%, in real terms, when you look at inflation, any figure that you're having that is greater than that figure is a real terms cut.
And would you say that's the same for partners as well, such as local authorities? The reason I ask this question is, so this comes up quite regularly in sort of national debates around local funding, where the government will always put out a statement saying, but they're increasing local spending power. What they mean is, the amount of council tax that councils are able to raise, or funds from the taxpayer have increased, even though the government grant has decreased. But is that something that you're seeing in real terms, or in terms of spending power with partners as well as the GLA? Yes,
we are. I can't put exact percentages on it, but for example, in the autumn statement, the government said that it's increasing DEL budgets by 1% in real terms. 1%. We've just been talking about CPI being 8.7, 6.7, 4.7. Yeah. So if you do the maths, it's clear that any percentage that's increased, that's below in core power, which is below the current general rate of inflation, that has to be absorbed by all organisations that are reliant on government money. If you're talking to partners, it depends where they get their source of income from, but if they're a private sector organisation, then they'll put their prices up to absorb that. If they put their prices up, someone's going to have to pay for those prices. So in a circular economy, if you take sort of care home providers, for example, they'll put their prices up, but councils haven't got the increase in their budgets to afford an inflationary uplift in those care costs. Or if a housing provider puts their rents up, we don't get the increase to cover that. So someone's got to absorb that, and that then puts pressures on reserves, because your normal I&E doesn't cover that. Eventually councils' reserves start to deplete, and so hence why you're seeing local authorities up and down the country now saying we've got no money left. That is a real term impact between partners increasing prices and public sector not being able to afford the increased prices. Plus, we've had energy prices. It's not all about what providers have done, but energy prices, again, it's the private sector putting up their prices in order to cover their costs.
Okay. And just in terms of the budget process, because obviously at some point next year, or maybe January 2025 at the latest, we could have a general election. So are you making any contingency plans, or what are your contingency plans in terms of the budget process if a general election is called for March 2024?
Well, I like to say that our budget process, as a process, is robust enough to go beyond politics, because we're a corporate organisation and we set our budgets on the basis of what any corporate organisation should do. In terms of how much money we expect, again, you know, I try not to play politics with what we've got. What I do think, in terms of, I think where I know where your question's going, is at some point there'll be a fair funding review, and there'll be a review of how the business rates will work. If that's one particular thing.
Yeah,
I
not
mean, if that
not
is
quite.
your
I was
questions.
thinking probably more in terms of process and logistics and the knock-on impact on, let's say, budget meetings here or PERDA, or is there an impact in what we are able to do as an organisation if an election's
Well,
called
with
to...
PERDA, then we will have to look at, you know, if it's in January, then we'll have to look at our timetable and what we do when. I've not considered at the moment that there'll be a general election in January, for example, but if it does, we will have to look at how we work around that. A lot of this timetable, as I've explained to this committee before, it sits in the statute of the 1999 Act, the GLA. You know, if I wrote it, I wouldn't have 3 steps, because, for example, we have this consultation budget, which we have to do this side of Christmas before we actually know what our settlements are. So it almost sort of, you know, we have to think about what's the value of producing stuff before we have all of the information. We would have to review how we do our consultation, how the council tax is set. If your question is about process, then we'll have to look at it if that time was to happen. But I don't know if it will be in January. It could be in May, it could be in October.
Sure.
Problem with not having a curved desk, I couldn't quite see your subtle eye movement. In that case, the next question, well, we move on to a new section which is about budget structure and overview with Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you. Morning. So the Mayor's has the power to raise his part of the council tax by 2.99%, and then there's the other elements as well to fund TfL and policing. Can you talk us through the process of what normally happens to get to the decision of how the level of council tax is set? What kind of discussions happen with the Mayor's office?
So I haven't changed this process. I've inherited it, and this process is one that repeats year upon year. The Mayor's budget guidance is where the Mayor sets out his intention around what sort of assumptions he's making around potential increase to the council tax. Usually there would be conversations with the current administration around the cost pressures that exist across the group, and if, for example, we were ever in a luxurious position, which I haven't spotted yet, we haven't had one since I've been here, but if we were, where we didn't feel the need to have to increase council tax, then I would imagine that we'd be having a conversation to say, you don't really need to increase it because everything's fine and we've got enough money. We don't have enough money, and we don't have enough to cover inflationary rises. So what the Mayor looks for is advice around how high can he increase the council tax without breaking the principles that are, I forgot the phrase for it, but the referendum principles, so that we know what's the maximum government has.
So he looks at how high he can set the council tax. Is it fair to
He looks at
assume
what scope there is, but really up till recently it was 1.99%, and more recently it's been 2.9%. So there's not, you know, a big difference between whether he goes for 0 or up to 2.99. There's that element. There's the police element, which we always talk about, which is around the balance between what the government funds and what is then delegated to police preceptors, and the consequence of plugging the gap if we don't increase it. So by default, he knows that if we don't increase it to the precept level, when the government is issuing grant, their assumption is the bit we've given you is the bit you could have raised locally. If you don't, that's your choice. Yeah. So then he balances that against the pressures faced by the police. So he's looking at what pressures there are versus how much money would be generated through council tax, and then we have the separate TfL discussion again, which is another source of income for council.
So would you say that the assumption is it's going to be the maximum amount? Or it's always going to be
my assumption normally is I
presumption to
give
be
the
it's the
mayor what the
maximum
choices
amount.
are, and he
Yeah.
makes the decision. To date, he's gone for the maximum that's been provided.
Yeah. So that's what I was trying to think of the approach. Is it right? We'll start at the maximum amount and see if we can actually reduce that down, or does it work the other way around? See how low can we keep it, and then actually we keep adding things to it. It sounds like we start from the presumption that it's going to be the maximum amount.
No, not really. We sort of start with saying what are the pressures that the group is facing, and my advice usually is
Take the maximum amount.
take the maximum that you can, because unless we're going to go through lots of savings and cut lots of activity, then the choice is, especially in I've only been here since during the pandemic and during a high inflationary area, so I've never had the luxury of being able to say to him, you don't need to increase it.
So do you think there's any likelihood of going for a referendum at all? To look at going above the 2.99?
Not that I've been aware of, no.
No.
We've never had that conversation. The only one that might have been was the TfL £20, but the policy statement the other day has given, with reluctance, the government has given permission for the final £20 out of the three lots of £20 increase to TfL. That would have pressed over it, but there's no indication at all that the mayor would go over.
Okay. So I think sort of from where we are and what you've said, the presumption's got to be that we're going to be going for maximum increases in council tax.
Which is what the budget guidance says.
Yeah. My next question was sort of covered off in an answer you gave a while back, and it's about that process, especially around the late arrival of key information from partners and how difficult it is. And I genuinely understand how difficult it is for officers to work within those tight time frames. Now, I know we've had sort of off-the-record chats about this, but for the benefit of the committee and the huge audiences at home, what sort of suggestions would you have about sort of improving the way that information flows through, or helping some of the partners to get their financial reporting in on time?
Well, it's difficult for them because, first of all, we have staff turnover, so you have there's always turnover every year at somewhere in the family of senior finance posts. So when new people come in, they have to come to grips with it. So no matter how much training we do, how much agreement we have with processes, you're still reliant on human beings that will come into the role, recognise the process we have, get up to speed with it, and actually comply. So there's always going to be the human factor that you have to bear in mind. We try and make the process as smooth as possible by talking to them through the year. We don't just wait till the sort of autumn and then speak to them about their budget process. So we have done that. We look at the in-year pressure so that we're almost building the picture for the future years as we're doing it. The solution that would make the process easier would be if we had multi-year settlements, to be honest with you, and that's outside of our gift. Multi-year settlements would cut a lot of this process out because it'd be just fine-tuning it each year. We don't have that luxury, so it feels a bit stop-starty. And whenever in anything that you're doing, if you do the stop-start bit, you lose that momentum.
Yeah.
So that would be ideal, but that's not in my gift. We try and give some level of stability by when we're allocating budgets, try and make as much of it recurring as we can so that we don't have to have those conversations. One-off funds are normal because either the source of funding is one-off, but also sometimes you want to pilot something to see if it works. You want to be able to switch the tap off on it if it doesn't. But our process at the moment is within statute, so unless we change the statute that says let's streamline this free attempts process of consultation, draft, final draft, and then you've got the individual component budgets that are in March, it feels like half the year we're budget setting. So, people have got day jobs to do, so it's not just about the budget process, but it does feel like we're constantly just doing the budget, and I question sometimes the meaningfulness of setting budgets too early. Because by the time you get to April, when the year begins, a lot of the budgets you see, people have been crafting since September, and they make mistakes because they're rushing them.
Yeah.
So if it was down to me, I'd cut some of the process, but I can't because the legislation doesn't let me. So
And something that happens every year because of that process is we get that late injection of cash. The last couple of years I've been here, there's something in the region of 200 million or something like that. that I think
That's
turns up.
based on what we get from the boroughs and their estimates,
Yeah.
which is something I'm sure we'll go into. But you can predict it to a certain level of certainty, but as I've said numerous times, and so has my predecessor, we're reliant on 33 billing authorities from both the council tax and business rates to give us their estimates. If you brought that forward, which it's not in our gift because the deadline is set by Deluxe, so in fact they're the ones that set the 31st of January deadline, not us. I have to ask the billing authorities to send us their returns on that date, and sometimes we don't get it till the 8th or 9th of February. If we did it earlier, then it widens the risk of margin of error on them, because then they're still in their current year and they're guessing the subsequent year. So unless you change the local taxation regime, so it's not reliant on the billing authorities, I can't see that changing. So this isn't me not having the imagination. It's genuinely, it's the environment we work in.
Yeah.
This is the current local taxation
Absolutely,
system.
and I said right at the beginning that I do understand the difficulty that officers
If
have with
government
this
gave us
process.
their settlement figure, if we got the settlement figures earlier, that would help.
Yeah.
But we don't get those until almost 1 or 2 days before they rise for Christmas.
Yeah.
So that doesn't help. So it's mostly about process. And
Yeah. And
based
you know,
on the
there's
current form of taxation that we
there's
have.
the cliche of the definition of insanity, isn't it? Doing the same thing over and over again, and that happens with that sort of 200 million that turns up. It's turned up, I think, every year for about, I think it was in the notes somewhere, for the last 6-7 years. I think there's been an extra 200 million turned up at the end, which is sometimes very frustrating to the budget committee, and it's a political decision, not an officer decision, but it's very frustrating to the budget committee because we ask where that money is going to be allocated to, and we're told every year, well, we can't expect that money to come in, and then that money comes in and it's allocated to a project that, you know, we didn't know about. Last time it was allocated to the free school meals, which was apparently turned around over a weekend. So I mean, and that is a result of the process, which, as you said quite clearly, is not ideal and something that I think we should continue pressure on. Just one last bit on this, Chair, if I could. There's a consultation process that goes on when the budget document is released. How many sort of responses do you normally get to that consultation, and what kind of people or organisations respond?
Well, until last year, not a massive amount. I think we've had about 900 people. I don't know the figures off the top of my head. When you look at it in the scale of the 9 million population of London, it's not significant. It's the Talk London site. But then last year we had this thing called ULEZ, and it suddenly
I did wonder.
It did increase the amount of people that were suddenly interested in our budget document. But again, even in the grand scheme of it, I think we had, no more than 1,500. So we had probably about 900 people at most for the non-ULEZ bit, and then there was about 1,500. So there was about 2,500 responses. But the ULEZ ones, we sent them back to the Mayor's office because it was political, and we as officers couldn't respond. The other stuff, we put it into categories, we summarised it. I think last year I sent it round to all of you as well, so I shared that. I sent it into the Mayor's office, and it's for the Mayor's office to consider what they want to do.
So
about
can you
this.
think of an example where, you know, due to the consultation and some responses that came in from it, something changed within the budget?
Not within the actual budget that year, because I think the way the process works, as we've just discussed, they come in quite late, and a lot of the thinking for the year ahead has already happened.
So what's the value of the consultation? I guess that's what I'm digging into. So
I
this
think
makes the
it's
kind of so what question.
No, it's a valid question. I think that it's what I've said before to this committee is the budget scrutiny and the budget challenge is not just about what we do between November and February. It's a full-on process. So representations are being made to the Mayor through that, along through other channels that people make, and people can consider. So if there's issues around, cost of living, then he might consider, if people have made comments about cost of living, he might consider putting something additional into the budget about cost of living or the warmer home schemes.
And I understand
those individual schemes.
You're treading the line between what you're doing as an officer and what's a political decision. So I guess the question is, as a result of the consultation process, there's never been an instruction to change or do things differently. So I guess
my response, I suppose, is as officers we gather the information, we pass it in to the political decision makers, when decisions are made about allocating money, I don't necessarily go back, and maybe we ought to do that, and cross-check between that new policy and when people have said something through a consultation process, because I'm sure that the Mayor and his administration gather feedback from public in many different ways around what they believe are priorities for Londoners. And so when we talk about new projects that come up in February, even if I haven't had a clue about it, someone's been advising him, so that when he makes a decision to allocate money, it's like, where did that come from? Someone must have said something. He didn't just wake up one day and say, I'll give these kids some free school meals. Someone must have said
Well, the
something.
interesting thing, Enver, is that is the assertion we put to the Mayor, and they completely denied that there is a wish list or anything like that. So,
Well, there are
and that
pressures.
happens every year. We have that
As,
conversation.
as I said, there's pressures within the corporate organisation, which, if you read the submissions, it's there, in here. But there are pressures that come from constituents, from Londoners, and those are the things that, as officers, I'm not always privy to.
Yeah, I understand that.
But the cost of living thing has been a major issue. London's recovery has been up till now. So most of the things that he's come up with have been around addressing those cost of living issues through schemes that his advisors have advised him on. It's not me. It might be other colleagues of mine.
And I'm trying to be very careful to make that,
Yeah.
that differential. Did you want to pause there before we move to the next section?
For two reasons. Firstly, I would like to welcome, we have a delegation of officials from the Iraqi Parliament who are joining us in the City Hall this morning. See how we do things. I'm sure learning great lessons on how we set our budget and scrutinise the budget process. And then the second reason is that Assembly Member Duval, I believe, has a question also on this section.
Sorry, I've got three quick questions that all related to this section, Chair. On maximum council tax levels, just remind us, are we penalised if we don't go up to the maximum level for the GLA element and the policing element of that? Is that true and correct?
Hello, Assembly Member. Yeah,
You're
I mean,
going to have to speak up a bit louder because I'm having trouble hearing you.
yeah, sure. On the police precept, it's as I described, that if when the government's working out how much police grant to give,
Yeah.
in their calculations, there's an assumption that on the police precept, that authorities will raise the income through the police precept. So therefore, when they're allocating money, the assumption is you're going to have that much from what you collect through local taxation, and we'll give this much through the grant. Penalisation is one way of describing it. Yeah, I get it. And
You probably like budget pressures or wish lists.
yeah,
Maybe
but
you'll have a
ultimately,
dilemma about it.
ultimately, what we learned from the decision by the then mayor back in 2016, 2017, when the police precept was not increased, it had an immediate impact of about £33 million that year. That has had a consequential impact year upon year upon year, and I think, if my maths serves me correctly, I've been told that it's somewhere in the region of £250,000 now, cumulative, that's not in the baseline ever since that one decision from that year, because we can't go back in a subsequent year and make the precept double to catch up. So that's always there, and if you look at some of the gap that the police are now saying they've got, coincidentally, it's in that sort of area. So that might not have been a problem had that precept been increased. So this mayor hasn't, as much as it's pained him to do so, he takes the fact that if he doesn't do it, that money is lost to the police forever.
So that strategy of maximising your income and making sure you keep that level up rather than losing it on that way that you described. Can I just turn to TfL, which is slightly different, isn't it? So on TfL, the levy, the council tax levy that's introduced there, arises out of government negotiations coming from COVID, from the impact of COVID on TfL revenue. So that TfL element is paying for concessions. Is that in its entirety because the government refused to pay for those concessions? Are you able to tell us during this part of the process that you've asked government to take that back on board, which they did in previous years, pre-COVID? And are they still saying no, they don't want to pay that and this should come off the council tax? Is that where it is if you want to continue with the policy?
So I'm not privy to the individual negotiations with government. The government had set out what it funds and what it's not going to fund in a letter in August 2022. The current topic of negotiations is around the shortfall of at least 500 million on capital. My understanding, and it's probably more for TfL to confirm this, is that the negotiations around the concessionary fares has not been reopened because that was government's position, and the mayor is protecting those concessions through the council tax, and that's now been baked into the bottom line now forevermore. So that is now TfL this year will have £244 million baked into its baseline to cover for these type of additional activities that the mayor has put upon them, rather than that being the national policy.
Now, going back to the previous strategy, which I called it maximising your income, shouldn't we be asking government at this moment in time, do they want to fund this element again as they did pre-COVID and go back to normal circumstances? I think we might know what the answer will be, but if we haven't asked, we won't know, will we? Things change, or do you think that letter has cut off? That's a new arrangement that will last forever and a day in terms of our budget structuring and what we need to take into account in the future.
So the mayor wrote to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor ahead of the autumn statement, and TfL was one of the key areas in his letter. The primary ask, because obviously if you make the letter too long then everything gets ignored, but the primary ask was the 500 million around the capital. Yeah. I don't know in the official negotiations, because I'm not in the room, whether TfL or the mayor's advisors are revisiting that discussion. It's always a good idea to ask, but I haven't got any evidence either way to suggest that topic has been reopened, because this time round the mayor's focused on plugging that £500 million important capital gap, because that has an impact on our infrastructure and jobs around the UK. So I think quite rightly he's focused his ask on some very specific things rather than reopening things he's already got scope for.
Okay, thank you. Can I now turn to retained business rates? How long have we been, I had to remind myself, my memory's failing. How long have we been dealing with retained business rates in the current form that we have?
The current form, this current regime was in 2013, 2014.
Fine,
but in that, it hasn't been exactly the same every year because of reliefs and multipliers and tariffs and levies, so those bits change.
It's developed over a period of time, isn't it? So in terms of, I'm going to call it an hierarchy, you'll call it something else. In terms of the call on that expenditure, in terms of budget making, how's that determined? Is that determined by government, local government and the mayor negotiations? You might not be part of those negotiations, of where the spend, once we've identified what the final amount of the retained business rates we can use, how is that proportioned out? What's the negotiations leading up? Because it doesn't just happen a couple of days before Christmas. We know that's the amount we get, but obviously there must be some thinking and development of what areas that money's going to be spent on, and it's decided in a tripartite way. So how would that, how does that work?
It's varied over the years. So when there was the 100% retention for the 2018, the 2019 years, there was a bit more of a tripartite negotiation with the boroughs, and what was created was the Strategic Investment Fund, of which the GLA had 185 million. So that was the what I would call the extra bit, and that 185 was for GLA projects, and GLA had the decision. The mayor, with within the group spent that money, and I think there's less than 30 million left of it. Boroughs had their share and they spent their bit. When we then reverted back to the current 67%, the mayor, that's not split with the boroughs because that's our bit. That's our bit. So then the mayor has to decide where does that go. Within that, you've got certain percentages because of what was rolled in from fire, what was rolled in from the TfL, capital grant. So those grants stopped, and the GLA gets its money through the business rate. That bit isn't discretionary. So when you then look at the percentages, when the mayor's allocating out in the mayor's budget guidance, TfL gets 84% of that business rates. Fire gets a certain percentage. In my time, over the last 3-4 years, then the mayor uses any top-up as he pleases. So in the allocations, the 2.5% or the 2% that we allocate in July, it's almost prorated as per previous years, keeps going to the same places in the same way, similar to the council tax. The bit that comes in later, in February, if some of that is regarded as recurring, that then becomes part of the baseline for the following year, and those percentages start to change a little bit. But if it's one-off, it doesn't change it ongoing, it just changes it for the top-up bit. And what we're talking about is, of the £2.4 billion of business rates, the bit that comes in is somewhere around 1%. So it doesn't really alter things in the big scheme of it. It sounds like a lot of money, it is a lot of money, I'm not belittling it, but actually in terms of the budget process, it doesn't change things very much going forward. So last year he spent most of it on the free school meals. If it comes in again this year, the mayor's got to make those decisions as to what to do with that. If I said to him, I think some of this is recurring, then once that's allocated somewhere, that stays where it's been put.
And that's quite important. So following on that question, to enable you to plan more than year on year and to pick up those recurring elements, what's the threats to this scheme? In the sense that, you know, in terms of the retainment of issues, what can you safely predict year on year? Where's the threats come to in this scheme and this pot of money, which is now taking on since 2014, even though in the scheme of things, you're right, relatively small, but it's pretty significant if it's not there. If I take it away from you tomorrow, I think there will be howls a bit, wouldn't there? It'd cause a few problems, wouldn't it?
It would.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things, and I don't want to take up the committee's time because this is, I could do a 3-hour lecture on it, but in simple terms, let's look at the variables first of all. First of all, where does this business rate comes from? Well, it comes from within the boroughs. So you've got 33 individual authorities' estimates that build that number up. How robust are those numbers? Is it recurring or not? Well, it's based on what they've declared and what they've estimated. What can change? Well, what can change is when their accounts are finally audited and signed off, then you know that that figure that you've incorporated. So this is the local bit. I'll come on to the national bit in a minute. The local bit then is, if, for example, you take one particular authority, let's say, I'm not going to be shy about it because it's in the press. Let's take Tower Hamlets. Tower Hamlets hasn't had its accounts signed for about 4 years now. In the numbers that I work with and my team work with, they're one authority, and that's 1 year. That number could change. So let's say, for example, suddenly Tower Hamlets, all the accounts finally get audited for 2018, 2019. They discovered that they've overstated the business rates by £40 million. Then they get their 1920 accounts, and that's, say, another 40 million, and then so on and so forth. It could be that we've overbaked the business rate. I've got to claw that back. Where am I going to get it back from? Well, I give 84% to TfL. I've got to take 84% of it back off TfL. So I make the situation worse. If you look in previous budgets, TfL have been paying us back £87 million, but the government gave us the luxury of spreading it over 3 years. So that 87 was actually 3 times that amount, so 240, whatever it was. We took it back off them relating to a previous year's total deficit. Now, Tower Hamlets aren't the only ones. So you multiply up all of the different authorities that haven't had their accounts audited. If their numbers start to change, and it starts hitting, it's going to be like a tsunami, it's going to hit us, and I've got to cover that, because the mayor's going to turn around, whichever mayor we have, is going to say, what are we going to do? So I can't empty the coffers out and give it all away. I have to build volatility reserves, which I've got to cover a little bit. But this could happen. And the reason why it might happen is there might be an amnesty with the Department of Levelling Up to say, do you know what, let's just play catch up and let's just assume that all those accounts are audited for the last 4 years. I'm not saying the treasurers are agreeing to that, but that's what's been proposed. What does that do to the business rates numbers and the council tax numbers that we've been assuming in the GLA? Multiply that up. We get 120 returns each year across the authorities. Multiply that 120 up by the number of years of accounts not audited. That makes a big difference. So I did see an MQ that came in the other day from one of our Assembly members that said, you know, why do you think it's necessary for you to report on how many accounts have been published? That's why. Because you need to understand the variability of how many different... It's not my team that sits there and calculates this. They add it up and then actually get errors as well. So there's certain boroughs that get it wrong and they get it 30 million wrong one way, and that's a £60 million swing to what we assumed we were going to get. So that's the first bit. That's the bottom-up approach. Then with the scheme, you've got what's called the pilot and the retention. We could be 50%, we could be 67%, we could be 100%. I don't know until December each year if we get to retain our pilot status or not. If the government said you can have that pilot status for the next 5 years, I could take a sigh of relief and go, oh, that's really good. At least we know that now. Then it might not be £200 million, that's a surprise. But the 200 million is useful because if we did suddenly get all those accounts that we're caught up with, it gives a bit of a buffer, because I won't be saying to the mayor, here, what would you like to do with it? It'll be, sorry, I've got to have that first because I've got to pay these people back. Yeah, and so it's not the choice the mayor gets then. It becomes CFO decision, because first comes first, I've got to pay the bills to keep the lights on, which is give the money back to the boroughs. So we've been creating all sorts of provisions and stuff. COVID's hit us. Government's been giving reliefs, so I think in some ways that's been really, really helpful that the government's been doing that. But what it's done to an extent is it's masked the real impact that's being faced by boroughs, which is now starting to surface. So as well as the inflationary catch-up, we've got the impact of who can't afford to pay their business rates, who can't afford to pay the council tax. So that's the second bit. What does that pilot scheme do? The third threat we've had has been this promise, or threat, depending on how you look at it, of a review of the whole fair funding formula and the business rates. It's only this year that I sort of said to the powers that be, because of the potential general election, I don't think anyone's going to change this. So at least we can start assuming some of this money is recurring. But it's only recurring, I think, for 1, maybe 2, maximum 3 years. What happens then? So if whoever wins the general election will probably want to relook at this system, and at that point, GLA may lose out significantly.
Thank you very much, Chair. The reason why I asked that question was because of future years, and we may want to think about how we look at this issue again in the coming scrutiny sessions in the future, really, and we just need to carry it on. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Just on that, the I mean, this dynamic you described, like with the Met budget, where you get a decision in 1 year not to increase the precept, which then you describe this sort of compounding or ripple effect over the years. That's created by the cap, isn't it? Because you can't go back and have an increase. It's a one-time deal. If you don't increase it this year, you can't have this year's increase next year.
Yeah. So what one would have thought could have happened is when the administration that came in that year at the very, very beginning, if they'd spotted it then and realised what the predecessor had not done, they might have asked for an increase in the threshold from government to get the Secretary of State to approve, to add that on for a subsequent year for the police to plug the gap. It's too late now to go back and try and recoup £240 million that would be a phenomenal amount to have to add on to the council tax in one go, which would be a permanent increase to people's bills.
Do you know if the mayor has he made any representations to remove that cap? Because it creates, I mean, not to be political, but the stated purpose of a cap like that is to limit the increase. But as you've just described, it creates a perverse incentive to grab the increase, because if you don't grab it this year, it won't be there next year, and it's a sort of expiring resource.
I think
so it creates a perverse incentive to have an increase every year.
So he's asked for his increase because of the £20 on the TfL. So that in itself is a request to go above the limits, and that's quite a significant one, especially 3 years in a row. So that's £60 plus inflation that's been added. To then ask for an extra on the police bit, I mean, it's a political choice, but
I mean, has the mayor, to your knowledge, lobbied to have that cap removed or
no? Because I think
increased?
in some ways he sort of has always said that the council tax is a regressive tax, and it might sort of contradict his views to then ask for the cap so he can add more council tax. So it's either regressive or.
So it might be that the previous mayor had a similar thought. You see?
Yeah, possibly.
Is my point.
Previous mayor didn't increase the council tax.
This perverse incentive, of course, exists with rent controls as well. I mean, it would create the same perverse incentive for landlords. Just talking about freezes in increases, which then create a sort of long-term legacy. Has there been a similar effect with the freeze on TfL fares on TfL's budget?
You'd probably have to ask TfL that specifically. You could argue that some of the gap in their funding might have been closed if the fares had increased, if the same number of passengers had continued. But also you have to look at the fact that TfL have been making savings, some significant savings that are baked into their bottom line, which might have closed the gap. So it doesn't mean that £1 increase in fares is a forevermore problem on TfL, because their savings might have absorbed it. I mean, you could argue the same with the Met, but the Met have saved, I think, cumulatively about £1.1 billion, but they still have a gap, the demand there. Whereas the TfL, I see it more like a commercial business, and they've got new lines opening, generating more income. So I don't compare the two like for like. I think TfL could have, before the pandemic, absorbed the lack of fare increase by their activities and what they're doing in cutting costs. Okay. I don't necessarily think the police have got the same freedoms, because they can't control the demand on their services in the same way.
Well, arguably the police's job is to control the demand on their services, but it's not quite such a direct link.
Yeah,
I will
exactly.
grant you that.
Their demand doesn't generate more income for them, whereas TfL's income generates more money. So they're different models.
Sorry, I don't quite understand what my Labour colleagues are saying. My understanding is that the police's job is to reduce crime, which is the thing that demands on their services.
No, just to say that there's complex factors into causes of crime, such as socioeconomic circumstances, education, job opportunities, and a lot. It's a really flippant throwaway comment, so I had to come in there.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, I think it's also a flippant throwaway comment to suggest that poor people and less educated people therefore driven to crime. So I think on that note, we will move forward to environment.
That's on what I said.
Climate budgeting, which I believe is Assemblymember Fortune.
Thank you very much. I think it was about 640 million was lost without the TfL increase. I remember reading about it at the time. Enver, can you tell us what what is the purpose of the Green Finance Fund?
The purpose of the Green Finance Fund is to help give some cash injection on a loan basis at a cheaper rate of loan towards investments that have got some way of cleaning London's air.
Okay, and are there any limits, boundaries, rules for how that Green Finance Fund can be used?
There's a criteria.
Criteria. Okay. What is that criteria?
I don't have that right in front of me. There are criteria around the duration. There's criteria around the green benefits of it. But I don't have all of that criteria in front of me.
Because one of the concerns was that actually what it didn't become was just a finance vehicle for projects that we could get funding elsewhere, but I know someone else is going to come on to that. The reason I ask is that there's 150 million pounds of it, I think, spent on the ULEZ expansion. I just wondered if there were any other alternative funding options that were considered for that expansion apart from the Green Finance Fund.
Well, I've again, some of it's political, so I'll steer away from it. But if you're looking at what money is available to TfL, and we've just talked about there's at least £569 million of shortfall on their capital budget, then they need to prioritise things that they can't use elsewhere. So what they've been doing is trying to think about ways that we can allocate funding to them from other sources. That then means that they've still got that money available to do the other things that they could have done that aren't eligible for the Green Finance Fund. So they'll look at various pots of money and say, this one will get public sector decarbonisation fund, this one's government funding, this one's covered from fares, oh, we've got some green finance money here, we can use that. So a decision was made that the ULEZ could be covered by a loan which will pay itself back through the ULEZ income. So it's a 4-year payback, and that money that comes back is then recycled and issued to other parts of the group.
So there's a couple of things there. So it's a 4-year payback. When is it estimated that the ULEZ will stop generating sort of significant income?
I don't know off the top of my head, but it does start the compliance rates. I mean, if you do you know that? Because I think it starts to flatline, doesn't it?
Yeah, so ULEZ compliant is forecast to reach 98% by the end of next financial year. So, you know, as you get nearer to 100% vehicle compliance, your income generated falls naturally.
So doesn't that leave a gap then?
No, because when the loans are given on the GFF, it's not on the basis that that scheme will pay it back, it's the organisation will pay it back. So
it's not scheme specific?
It's not the scheme. The scheme has to show it's generating payback, both in terms of carbon and money, but the scheme itself doesn't have to pay all the money back. It's the organisation that's borrowing the money that has to pay the money back. So if the scheme falls over, that organisation still needs to pay the money back. So if, for example, someone was to come along and can ULEZ, right, TfL still needs to pay that money back. They can't turn around and say to us, well, it's not there anymore, because as far as we're concerned, we've lent it to them. If you borrowed money to do an extension on your house and you didn't, the bank's not going to say, don't worry about it because you didn't build your extension. The bank's still going to hold you to account to say, give back the money that you've borrowed. So what we do is the scheme attracts the money, that it's doing something to clean the air, but it's the organisation that we hold to account, not the scheme. The scheme is a viability to think, okay, we'll give you some money to get that scheme going, but not all schemes pay back that money in the time frame. But we decide when we're lending it that we want the money back over 4 years.
And there'll be an assessment of that scheme or any scheme to see actually whether or not it was effective in what its stated aim was.
We'll have to do that. I mean, we have non-executive directors who are much more expert on green finance than me, who sit on these things, and before the money's given, they challenge it. And, you know, I take advice. I chair the committee, but ultimately, if these green finance experts were to say to me, this is not a good deal, then I wouldn't approve it.
Is that paperwork public?
Yeah.
Okay.
And if it isn't,
it'd be useful to see that. Very quickly, I'm going to be parochial for a bit and talk about God's green borough of Bromley, and talk about the Crystal Palace National Sports Centre, which is having some funding from the Green Finance Fund.
That's not been approved yet. They've asked for it.
Okay, all right.
It's still going through. Validation. And what I can't do, as some of you will be aware, I can't give you the total cost of the Crystal Palace scheme because it's a commercially sensitive thing. I can tell you offline. I can't tell you in this committee for commercial sensitive reasons.
That pulls my legs right out, doesn't it?
I know. But they've asked for £30 million for phase 1. It's very exciting what they're asking for. I'm hoping that we will get something that stands on its own 2 feet and that we can approve it. But as we sit at the moment, it's still working its way through the pipeline. It hasn't actually come to the credit committee yet.
Any idea of timelines to get to the end of the pipeline?
Well, I've put a credit committee in for next week, so I'm hoping it appears there. I haven't seen it yet. I spoke to the programme director about it and encouraged it, and I looked at the plans,
Yeah.
and I think it will stand up, and I'm behind it, but I think it needs a bit more strengthening.
Yeah. I went down to look at the presentation. It was very impressive.
So very keen,
Yeah.
and it's another way of helping to plug some of the gap, because there's a lot of work that's needed down there, and I want to get phase 1 through. So we've got the capital money to cover phase 1. If we can top it up with the 30 million from the Green Finance Fund, that gives us enough to cover phase 1.
Fantastic. All right, we'll chat about this offline. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. In terms of the paperwork you were just talking about, this was the minutes from the credit committee you're talking about.
No, I was thinking about the application of the business case for the ULEZ.
Or any other project, because you think that is public. I was just speaking to my boffin here who thinks he hasn't seen it.
I don't publish them.
Okay.
I'm
I
just
see.
talking
So-
about
so-
what...
sorry,
I suppose what I'm thinking about is what I can share and what I can't share.
Understood.
So I'll need to double check that.
Yeah, if you could share that with us, that would be lovely. Thank you very much. Or some, whatever information you can, because I think we have not very much visibility into it.
Okay.
Is where we feel. Okay. Continuing on the theme of green finance, we have Assembly Member Russell.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just want to go back to the ULEZ and the funding for that. So am I right in understanding that if ULEZ was cancelled, then that loan money is still repayable? And have you got a figure in terms of what that would potentially cost?
Well, it'll cost whatever they've borrowed and what's still outstanding.
Plus interest?
Plus interest. It'll be... I can't remember the rate of interest that we gave, but it was below the public, the PWLB rate. So it will be whatever interest is due back on it.
Okay, thank you. It's useful to know. Assemblymember Fortune mentioned the kind of tick box green projects which might have been funded by other mechanisms. So what are the safeguards that the GLA has in place to ensure that projects that are approved by the Green Finance Fund are properly delivering benefit that wouldn't have happened otherwise?
Good question. I think the... because it's relatively early days, at the moment the safeguard we have is the rigour of what gets approved and what doesn't get approved in terms of the criteria. It goes through a green steering group, first of all, and that has to pass all of the environmental focus challenges that are there, and those guys are experts at this. It then has to come to the credit committee, which then goes through another level of checking around its credentials, around what it's actually saying it's going to do, and the finances and the costs of it. The bit that then that will be monitored. So if it's within the group, we'll then incorporate that into the normal climate budget monitoring. What I haven't quite worked out yet, and I'm not saying just because I haven't, it doesn't mean someone else hasn't, is the monitoring of the money that's lent outside of the GLA group to other organisations, and how we're checking that those schemes are still delivering what they're supposed to be delivering.
And those would be like local authorities or other sort of
local
public
authorities,
bodies.
NHS, the museums. So the criteria that we spoke about at the last committee that I was here at.
Yeah.
So those type of organisations. So the rigour will be at the point that you allocate the money. From a pure finance point of view, all I care about is that they're paying it back. From a green finance hat on, I'm also interested in what is it actually delivering. So we have to capture that in the round through the wider green finance work and the green work that we do. But my environmental colleagues work very closely with the teams in those organisations. What I don't know for sure, and you'll have to probably ask them, is what they do on an ongoing monitoring basis. But it's still early days, because I don't think any of these schemes... Okay, ULEZ is up and running, but some of the other ones haven't happened yet. Some of the TfL ones are. So we talked about the LED lighting. So the lights are starting to change in a lot of stations. So I'm assuming that if that's happened, I'm not quite sure what more monitoring one can do, because I'm assuming if they've changed the old type of lighting to the LED lighting, then job done. On the basis that whoever agreed that LED lighting is the right thing to do has checked that in the first place. And so, of course, once the LED lighting, so you think, okay, it is done. There'll always be newer, better LED lights. So at what point do we keep changing them? But
so the kind of I mean, so I suppose it's kind of managing that risk that the projects don't deliver on the green benefits that got through the approvals process with the Green Steering Group and the Credit Committee. It's kind of, have we got mechanisms in place to double check on the delivery of those green benefits?
I'll have to double check that, but I mean, it's something that we should be doing.
Okay, well, maybe
my assumption is that my environment colleagues stay
Yeah.
close to it. It's outside of my remit. Once we've given the money, and I've got people that are checking that it's being paid back, I'm checking that we've gone through the rigour before the money's allocated in terms
Yeah.
of does it hit the criteria.
Maybe we can pick that up later in the process with the environment teams, so that we're absolutely clear that there isn't a kind of space for things not actually being delivered.
Just check, no one's messaged me to tell me, but no one's given me the answer,
No.
so I'm guessing that it hasn't happened.
Okay, so my other question is about Scope 3 emissions, and this is the bit that's potentially really difficult, because it's the emissions that come from the consumption of goods and services in London but are emitted outside the London boundary during the production phase, and that is going to be a much harder piece to manage, monitor and keep track of. So can you confirm what the plan is for and the timing for adopting the Scope 3, including the Scope 3 emissions in the climate budgeting process?
So last year when we did it the first time, being typical me, I sort of said, right, first year we're going to do this, second year we're going to do that, and the third year we're going to do this. And people said, whoa, hold your horses. And I said, no, not until somebody tells me I'm being ambitious. I've been told I'm being ambitious, and I am being ambitious. I was trying to find the right script, and I can't find it, so if you can dig it out for me while I'm giving the Assembly member the update.
So, yes,
so
because
the answer to it then is we can't do it by 25-26. It's too hard.
Yeah.
Oslo have been doing this for 7 years, and they've only just, and they're a much smaller city than us, and they're further ahead in terms of their clean air, and they've only in their 7th year introduced Scope 3.
Yeah.
So, on that
I'm
basis,
really relieved to hear that, because
I'm glad you're relieved, because I was thinking you're going to tell me to do it
I raised it before over the previous years that blimey, Scope 3 is really ambitious, so actually acknowledging that shows that you're trying to do it properly.
So I can't find the exact script, but let me tell you, we were the first pilot city to get Scope 1 done. We're still ahead of the game. So we're doing our second year of climate budgeting and talking to boroughs, and some cities haven't even done their first. So we're still ahead of the class. Really good stuff. And London, big city. That's really good. Level 2 is proving to be a bit harder. Not all boroughs jumped for joy to join us. I've got a list back at the ranch, and Assembly Member Hirani has asked for the list. I didn't want to say it out in a public meeting because I don't want to put people off, but I can circulate the list of the 13 that we think are with us on this journey. The others have said they might do it in 25-26. So what we've agreed with the environment team is that this 24-25 year and 25-26 year, we will get level 2 to a really good place. I think there's more work to do on the climate budget returns that have come in for this round. I'm not overly happy. There are justifiable reasons for it, but I think by the time I get to the February publication, I'd like to see some of these climate budget returns and some of the gaps filled. I get some of them can't be, but some of them, there's gaps in places that I was a bit disappointed when I saw the overall returns. And then next year I want to make it even better. It doesn't mean just because we're not building scope 3 into the climate budgets that we're not doing scope 3 work. The environment team is actually doing that. What they're saying is it's probably a bit too ambitious to get to scope 3 at least within the next 2 or 3 years. So we'll take stock each year, we'll update you, we'll update the committee. We don't want to give up on it, but I'm a reasonable person, and previously I was being a bit too ambitious, and now that they've explained the reasons why it's too hard, I get it. We just don't have the resources to incorporate it, and let's get level 2 in there first of all. So it doesn't mean we're giving up. It just means if once they told me that Oslo's only just done it, and you heard Oslo speak in one of the previous committees, I've got to take some notice from that.
Yeah. To be honest, if you can get the level 2 emissions into a good place over this next couple of years, you know, that would be an incredible achievement.
Yeah, I think
and it's much better that we actually do this properly than that we claim we're doing what we're not doing. So actually that candour is really appreciated. And because I'd been wondering, because it had been, we were expecting scope 3 in 25-26, and then it kind of seemed to be 26-27. So actually it's much better, and now you're saying it could actually be a bit later than that.
It needs to be later. What I haven't got is I don't want to be talking out of turn here, but I haven't got sign off from the relevant deputy mayor and the mayor that I can push it back, but the environment team will be advising that it's not, in their eyes, feasible to stick with 25-26, and I think the mayor's going to be reasonable about it. We're not saying to the mayor that we're trying to push back his targets, but we can only do what we can do. That's a reasonable pace.
I mean, you know, I'm kind of responding completely off the cuff here, but it does seem that if you can do, but what we will as a committee want to see is that scope 2 emission work being done in a really robust way, because it's absolutely fair enough to say we've been over ambitious, and from my reading of all the data, it felt over ambitious. But so what we are going to want to see and track is the work that's happening on scope 2, so that we can actually see that that's really, really embedded and making a proper difference. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Pigeon.
My mic. Oh, no.
There you go. You're up and running.
It's flashing green. It's now on red. Good. Okay. Yes, I was going to ask you about scope 3 because I think that's it's very difficult. So I think it's good that you're pausing on that. I recall at the previous meeting we weren't sure that you had, and Phil Graham we questioned. I wasn't convinced he had the resource even for the next scope 2. Really, I didn't feel it was being developed. Do you feel that the organisation's got enough resource in place to help with this climate budgeting?
I thought we did at one point, and then we've had some turnover. These people are really hard to recruit, and they're really hard to retain. So there's recruitment going on again. So feels right that it's hard. That everyone's trying to do this, which is good news, but it means we're all fishing in the same pool for the same limited resource. Because the green stuff's really difficult, finance is difficult, and then you put those two together. You're after a very, very niche market of people who know what they're talking about. I want people that know more about it than I do. And I mean, I've been on a steep learning curve, but what I know in comparison to these people that we're bringing in is minuscule. But I don't need to know everything because that's what we employ them for. So
we need to get the resource in for that. Okay.
Some of it, we've got some teams, but we've got I think we've got 3 vacancies that are rising out of those because these people are being nabbed from elsewhere, sorry to use the word, but
the sell of working on London leading the way on this, I would have thought, would be rather good for people.
There's a lot of private companies that sell these services, and once someone's got this experience, they pay very good money.
Of course they do. Of course they do. And then just going back to the Green Finance Fund, what was the figure for the original ULEZ loan to TfL? What was the...
I think from memory it was 185 million.
It's 185 million.
It was in that.
So that plus the interest is what will need to be paid back over the term.
Yes.
Okay. And then...
I mean, we might be able to negotiate on how much of the interest. I mean, if this eventuality, we're talking theory here,
yes, we
but
are
if
talking
in
theory,
eventuality that was to happen, bearing in mind they are another member of the group and the funding is a bit circular, it'd be questionable whether we would then do what a bank would do, which is make them pay an early payment repayment. So I think it's at least the capital would have to.
I just wanted to get an understanding of the scale. And then in the written response to Oversight Committee in November, Catherine Barber said she would publish a detailed annual report for the Green Finance Fund. When are we going to see that? Because it feels we've been talking about this for the last few years. I want to see something concrete to really understand.
I think, I'm guessing here, but I think we're talking about June. The reason why I'm saying June is that although we've been talking about green bonds, that never really took off.
It didn't
but
take off.
This Green Finance Fund has really only been kicked off in earnest since I've been covering. So, and that was from about June. So my recollection would probably be about a year from then. So I would expect it to be about the same time as we do the annual, the accounts and everything else. So you sort of almost cut off around March time. Then you've got the rigor and the
financial year. Really.
Yeah, probably. So I would say that I don't want to overpromise, but I'd say that you should be seeing something around June time.
Okay, so that's one.
But in the meantime, we are updating the committee on progress around what we're investing in and what we're not. So actually, the annual report should be what you already know by that point, because hopefully we've been keeping you up to date anyway.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I don't see anyone else indicating to come in on the green finance, so we'll move on to the next section, which is looking at the Mayor's draft budget. And obviously there was this notorious 21% increase in staff costs, which we discussed last time. Where are we with that? What led to it? Because obviously that's quite an extraordinary position to be in, where we had a purported 21% increase in staff costs that wasn't real. It was an error somewhere down the line.
If I can just come on to it. So just first of all, I've sent our committee clerk here, our senior policy advisor, a paper 2 days ago on it, full explanation. But for the benefit of the public watching, there was an error, but the error wasn't in 24-25. What's been going on in finance is over the last year, we've been recruiting finance business partners. We've had a financial improvement program. So our quality of our finance work has been improving. So that's the first thing. Secondly, when we were focusing on the GLA Mayor side on moving from missions and foundations to themes, there was much more work being done to focus on what goes where in the budgets. Now, not to sound flippant, and it will sound it, but I don't mean this, the subjective analysis is an accounting analysis sheet that's done at the very last minute, and not a lot of attention has been paid to it in the past. 24-25 was done correctly, because when the team was looking at what costs it where, the analysis that was put in between staffing and programme, etc., was correct. What it exposed, though, and why it looked odd at the time, was what was this increase between 23-24 and 24-25. 23-24, when it was done, wasn't done in the way that I would have done it. What is the main difference? Well, the difference is that when you get a pot of money, say someone gives you £100 million and says, we're going to do this programme, the money, when it's first given to you, the accountants say, well, who's going to spend it? Okay, let's say that's this scheme. The money gets put into one place against that cost centre. The subjective is, well, what is it? Is it supplies? Is it staffing? Is it transport? It's that kind of stuff. At that time, sometimes it's not known. So people put it into the place that they think it should go, which is against supplies and services, which is where programme goes, because they don't know any other split. What you should then do is, as the programme develops and you work out there's an element of that, which is staffing, whilst we deal with it and we recruit the staff and we put it into the head count and we do all of the rigour, what wasn't happening necessarily is, in terms of the accounting treatment, was someone then doing an adjustment to the budget and moving it off the supplies and services line and putting it into staffing. When we allocated the staffing in 24-25 and we looked at each of the programmes, and I'm saying it's still work in progress, but what I'm comfortable is that the staffing element was correct. So we then started to move. I wanted the same exercise done, which we didn't have a chance because We went too early on the draft budget, and there's been a few mistakes that we've spotted, which we're fixing along the way. But there was so much attention into switching into the themes that I think some other things got dropped. And the team's only human, and their deadline was 3 weeks before all the other functional bodies, who still, some of them didn't hit that deadline. So actually what I was asking for was probably a bit too much, and it's no discredit to the team. The finance team did an excellent job, but we're doing a more excellent job now. So we've opened it up, and we started to move the stuff that was sitting in supplies and services into staffing. There was things that was also in staffing that shouldn't have been in staffing. So say, for example, you've got an external scheme, and say it's £10 million, and there was 4 million of it which was income from outside source. Income should go to income. But because it was netting off the staffing cost, that income was being badged against staffing. So I've taken that out as well. So there isn't the 21% increase. It's just that we were comparing apples and pears. So the actual figure for 23-24 was 102.7 million, and the actual figure, so in the original budget, and the actual figure for 24-25 is 106. So the difference is about 4 million, and there's ups and downs, but it's primarily the pay award for 24-25. So we've fixed it. It's not a new staffing cost. We've always counted the staffing. It's just that subjective analysis, which is a pure technical accounting analysis that you could say, well, why haven't people looked at it? I wish we had, but why hasn't anyone else noticed it? The point is, it's now done, and rather than asking for forgiveness, well, for permission, I'm saying, look, we've fixed it now, and from now on, there'll be more rigour in what we do, as we've got better people, better systems, and maybe better oversight.
I'm sure the oversight has been superb throughout. That makes sense as an explanation. I think in terms of structural incentives, I wouldn't want to beat you up about fixing a mistake, because I would want the incentive to be to fix the mistake. So I'm pleased that that's been fixed. And the figure that's in there now, so just so I'm clear in my own mind, the total amount of spending was correct, and it was simply within that, and it wasn't within which projects or which activity. It was how that was coded versus, as you say, staff costs or suppliers and so on.
That's right. There's a shortfall in that you'll see in the letter that comes to you. The current financial regulations doesn't permit movement from supplies and services into staffing, which is probably why the accountants didn't do it. But I've overridden it, and I'm going to be changing the financial regulations to get rid of that nonsense rule, because it doesn't make sense. I'm sure it was created at a time when it was stopping people from creating too much headcount, but then that creates a perverse incentive to go out and get externals in at higher rates to do things when you could employ them in-house.
So we're not only
why do we want to create rules that create a perverse behaviour? So I'm not going to shy away from it. This is an organisation that's growing, and we need staff to do it, and we need good quality staff, and we have to pay them the right salaries to do it. So whilst it's uncomfortable for some people to see the rising cost of staff, it's the right thing to do.
Well, so in that case, not only have you, so the current figure is now correct, you've corrected the figure, you've also have or about to remove a perverse incentive. So these are all good things as far as I'm concerned. And obviously this 21% sort of oddity has flagged that up and got them fixed. So I think that's a positive.
It wasn't real
sign.
21. It's that if we'd been doing that process right back from day one, that wouldn't have been an issue. And I don't know when that practice had been in place, and I don't have the resource or the time or the inclination to go back and fix it for years. What I'm saying is, going forward, anything that I find that needs fixing, I'm fixing. It's not me finding it. The team had spotted it when they were doing the themes work and said, this is what we need to do. And having high caliber, good accountants that are doing this, I don't want to disincentivise them by telling them off for finding something that was not right.
No, absolutely. Within finance, you don't want to incentivise people to hide problems to avoid them coming to light. Absolutely. So that's a positive story. I'm quite happy that. I suppose then, have we found one example of where this slightly unusual early budgeting process has generated some positive news? We're all scratching around to find a benefit of it. We're all stuck with it because of the statute. But anyway, maybe this is an example of where it's delivered a benefit.
I think working on it gives people a chance to get things right, because mistakes will happen whenever you start it. But I also need to think about people's welfare and how much we're pushing them into it. And actually, when they're focusing on budgets for 6 months, what is it that they're not doing while they keep on feeding the machinery of turning these numbers around? Yep. That's the issue. I'm not saying that transparency is a wrong thing, but they're also supposed to be advising the services that are, trying to deliver things, but we're constantly focusing on monitoring and updating budgets, whereas actually it's also important to be having time to do advice and actually to lift your head up and look over the horizon to say what are the threats that and opportunities that are existing, so that we can spend time doing negotiations, asking for more money, developing better business cases, but all we're doing is focusing on budgets.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that we'll get much dissent on that point. So on that positive point, just thinking about this change in from missions to themes, was there a sort of consultation process that you went through to, who did you talk to about that, either within the GLA or outside, about what that would mean? Not necessarily about whether you wanted to do it, but what that would mean, what the implications were.
So a few years ago, when I joined and I looked at our performance framework, I noticed that it was very inputs-outputs focused. And some of you will know that from my previous career, wherever I go, I like to transform things, and I'm quite outcomes focused. So I've looked at this in the Cabinet Office, I've looked at it at the Home Office, and actually looked at performance regimes and questioned, it's all well and good counting this stuff, but actually what difference does it make? How do you shift the dial? We had the pandemic, so we moved towards missions and foundations. I didn't have a great deal of say in those because the London Recovery Board, as it was then known, set the missions, but I had a say in how we moved forward with setting up the performance framework, because it sort of sits under me, but of course I work within a political setting. I don't think we were ready to move toward 100% outcomes focused when we did missions and foundations, but that was the intentive. We got so far with it, but the data didn't back up what we do. As we started to move forward, and I recognised that there were some people, both within the officials and non-officials, who were criticising the current missions and foundations, including some of the Assembly members, and we were looking at, actually, we know we're going to have to replace this. It was an opportunity to look at outcomes, to actually say, what is it that we're actually making a difference on? Inputs are easy, outputs are harder, outcomes are really hard. Then we had to look at, well, how would those shape? And we had to design something that, in my opinion, is evergreen, because whoever wins at the mayoral election, whether Mr. Khan returns or whether there's a new person, I'd want them to look at it and say, this isn't political, this is actually good practice. So I didn't consult too much. What I did do is I did talk to the Mayor's office, I did talk to executive directors and some of the senior team, but there's a risk that if you consult too wide, people misinterpret what you're trying to do, and people start worrying about their jobs, or they think you're getting political. It's not political. It's about saying, will we still do housing? Yes, we will. Will we still focus on the environment? We will. Will there still be things around social justice? Well, you might change the name on the box, but actually, what's that thing doing? And so what we're doing is we're now speaking to experts, to other places around how are we then going to measure what good looks like. And so we're building a set of outcomes under those themes, and then there'll be more work going on underneath that. So some of the projects and things we started to do a few years back under missions and foundations around logic change, theories of change, we're looking at that again. If I stop to do lots of consultation, although it's the right thing to do, I'm then not focusing on the task, because everyone's going to have an opinion, and I won't be able to please all the people all the time. So what I'd like to do is get it to a certain point where there's a straw person or straw thing to look at to say, this is what I think is evergreen, and then hopefully post-May we can talk to whoever comes in and say, what do you think? And I'm hoping that what we put on the table will be good enough that internally we would have consulted to the right degree. There'll be some bits that we can leave that can be fine-tuned to make it fit whichever flavour people want, but it has to be about delivery, and the delivery needs to deliver outcomes, and that's what the primary driver of this is. We're working to a piece of legislation that is outdated. We're working to a scheme of delegations that's outdated. This is an opportunity to press the reset button and to say, can we do things differently to measure outcomes that the GLA actually does, that there is a direct link to what Londoners expect. And whether we are delivering, or whether we're commissioning, or whether we are influencing or convening, we have to capture that to say, this energy, this resource, is making a difference where it matters. And you need a regime that picks up when it doesn't make any difference, that can then question that and say, actually, why are we doing this? We need to stop, and we need to recycle that money to where it makes a difference. And that needs to be driven by the mayor, but at the moment, as officials, we're doing what we're doing in order to build something that whoever is in charge says this looks good. And that's part of the governance, performance and financial regime.
Understood. That makes sense.
So I haven't consulted widely for the reasons that I've just said, that it's still being created.
No, I think it's a very clear answer. Thank you very much. Final question then on this, just in terms of this final. Sorry, I don't know if somebody was indicating then. Final question from me. There will be some further questions, evidently. In terms of this transition, one of the issues that we spoke about last time was obviously how we do the like-for-like comparison. Obviously, part of our work as a committee is to see how things that were progressing previously continue. Some of the things that were underway under the missions, obviously, as their termination point is this coming year, not the year just ending. The consultation budget that comes out, some of the recommendations that we made from last time, will those recommendations be in there that will allow us to do that like-for-like comparison and to check how things that were already underway confirm that they're underway and finishing correctly?
So I'm drafting a response to you at the moment. There's certain reasons what the consultation budget does, and there's things what the consultation budget doesn't do. So the consultation budget is not meant to replicate the component budgets. So some of the things you're asking for is a level of granularity that doesn't fit into the consultation budget, which is pretty much a council tax consultation budget from the mayor. It's already too long, and I'm trying to find ways of cutting it out. What you're asking for will be factored into the final GLA budget, the GLA component budget. In terms of the specific, which was around the transition from the missions and foundations to the themes, there's two answers to this, and I'll come on to the individual KPIs. The specific is we put an appendix in that showed how you went from missions and foundations to themes. We cut it one way. I had two different versions of it, and as we said in the committee, I think David Bellamy said it, was you can ask for whichever cut you want and we'll produce it. We can send those. I don't think there's much benefit in having 6 different alternatives in a public document because I'm not sure what value it adds, but actually we've cut it different ways. We're still building the SAP system, which belongs to TfL, so that hierarchy is very difficult. It's very manual, so it's not a quick thing to do, but we have cut it different ways. The bit you specifically refer to, which is around missions and then things going beyond 24-25, missions won't exist. So I just want to clear that misnomer up. Missions are stopping. I'm not going to continue to monitor on missions at the end of this year, but there are individual KPIs based on the recovery elements of those missions, which during the outcomes work, if they're deemed to still be suitable activities of work that fit within those themes, they will then make their way into the new performance regime. So those will continue if they're still shifting the dial.
Understood.
But the missions itself won't, because I don't have the resource to keep monitoring missions and foundations and directorates and themes. So we'll continue with directorates, we'll continue with themes, but missions and foundations will stop as a monitoring tool, but individual KPIs that continue past that April 24 will still be embedded into the new performance regime.
Okay, I think that is what we wanted, so that we could continue to make sure. I mean, because obviously the cynical view of it is that the change happens and then suddenly a whole lot of things that weren't going well get quietly forgotten about, and then we have all these new shiny things, and it's just making sure we can keep looking at the other things, which I think you've given us reassurance that we can. So
I think so. I mean, ultimately it will be each of the sponsors, the leads of those themes, to come back with what they think are the right KPIs, but my central team will just check what's happened to them. It's not ultimately just my choice, because those people are responsible and accountable for delivering a service, and therefore they need to have a set of measures that they can perform to, and there'll only be a set number of those, and it's important that they're focusing on the things that actually make a difference.
Yep. Okay. And I should say overall the switch to focusing on outcomes rather than inputs and processes is a welcome change.
And that will take a while to embed, because it's a big cultural shift as well.
Yes.
You know, I've wanted it, but it didn't happen overnight when we've done it in central government departments, and it won't happen overnight here, because people always default to inputs and outputs whenever you talk to them.
It's easier to measure the inputs. Anyway, Assembly Member Pigeon.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up from the discussion. You're clearly doing a huge amount looking at all our systems, Enver. What other technical issues have you found with how City Hall sort of does its accounts and finances that's not best practice that you might like to change in the future? And why didn't audit pick up this issue, which I'm surprised at, that you've talked about how you allocate staffing or supplies and whatever. And can you also update us on how many financially qualified staff you now have in the team and how many accountants? Because I recall from previous discussions that lots of staff working in finance didn't have any qualifications in it.
Well, quite a lot of question there, Assembly Member.
I know. I realise we're pacing the time.
Okay, so the auditors look at the actual figures in the accounts. Their focus isn't budgets, and the expenditure sits in the right place. So when you pay staff, that payroll hits the staffing subjective, right? So they wouldn't have picked up, and it's not their worry about the budgets because they're focused on are the accounts correct, and the accounts are good. So in terms of what other technical things, I mean, it's a robust system. It's a robust, we have a good finance regime. What we have is an antiquated ledger system that we use, which is TFLs, and that's going to be replaced going forward, which is why you saw in the GLA component budget an increase in some of the IT costs, and those will keep going up because we haven't invested over the last 20 years into some of those systems, because what the GLA was created to do and what the GLA does now are very different things. And what we've got is, I think, the equivalent, if you're looking at mobile phones, what we're using is one of those old Nokia bricks, whereas actually what I want is an iPhone 15 equivalent. And so that's what we're going to move towards. It'll take us a couple of years to get there, and that will improve. With regards to qualified accounts, I can't give you the exact total number, but everybody who's grade 10 and above in finance is a qualified accountant. So we've done that cut-off point. Anyone who's not qualified is not allowed to apply for the post above grade 10.
Okay, lovely, thank you.
Okay, don't see any other indications on that topic, which moves us on to the next topic, which is Transport for London, which is again Assembly Member Pidgeot.
Lovely, thank you. I'm not sure whether it's you or Elliott on this, but obviously you will have looked at what's been going on with TfL. You talked about it earlier. How do you assess TfL's financial sustainability for the next year, and what do you think are maybe some of the key risks?
Hi. So TfL's been through quite a challenging period the last few years, and obviously they're coming out of that now, and they've seen upticks in their passenger numbers, and they're forecasting for that to continue. They're heavily reliant on fares revenue to support their costs, and they're moving in the right direction. The forecasts that they've included in their budget submission show them increasing their reserves, which is one of the measures that they're using to track their self-sufficiency, to a level of 500 million by the end of next financial year. So that is a reassuring sign that their financial resilience is increasing.
So is it to or by 500 million, you said?
To 500 million. Their general reserve increases to 500 million by the end of the next financial year. So that's a reassuring sign about their confidence in their financial resilience. Now, obviously, those forecasts are reliant on many assumptions about the behaviour of London's commuters primarily, and the new environment of working from home has made those assumptions a lot more volatile. So I think that's a useful question to talk to about with TfL when they're with you. The biggest risk to TfL by far is on the capital side, and the substantial investment which is needed, particularly in the Piccadilly line, over the coming year or two. And the affordability of that is very dependent on contributions from the government, conversations on which have not yet concluded. So I know you've only recently received the budget submission, and we're very sorry for the delay in that. But that will have talked about a £500 million request, which has been made to the government. Different 500 million to the reserves one, so just try not to get confused. And we're still awaiting the outcome of those conversations with government. And, you know, if that 500 million capital investment is not forthcoming, that's extremely problematic, and will need considerable unpacking in how to respond.
Yeah, well, they're eking out the life of all these sets of trains, aren't they? Another 500 million, everything seems to be 500 million, is the facility that the Mayor announced in September 22 for TfL. Is that still going to be available? How much of it has been used or is planned to be used that you're aware?
To the best of my knowledge, Enver, jump in if I get it wrong, it's still available, and it hasn't been drawn down on.
That's correct. I can confirm that.
It's still going to be there.
It should be, because it's a cash drawdown facility,
so
and
it's just
our cash balance is touch wood, still.
There's no wood in this.
There's no wood, is there? But they are quite okay at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Now, you mentioned, Elliott, that the submission was late. Can you explain to us why it was not published by the deadline set out in the Mayor's guidance? Obviously, what impact this has had on you in terms of preparing the consultation budget, and were you even informed of the delay? What was going on there?
So, as Enver talked about earlier, we have an ongoing conversation with the functional bodies, so we don't publish the guidance, wait till the 24th of November and then hope for the best. So we knew that, firstly, we were reassured there was lots of robust work going on in TfL to produce their budget, and we were confident that was all going well. We were also well cited on the conversations they were having with government about the 500 million. The tricky thing was the sensitivity of those conversations with government, and the potential for publishing on the deadline of the 24th of November, preempting, undermining, jeopardising the conversations.
Showed their hand, basically.
Those were sensitive negotiations, still are sensitive negotiations. And the position TfL found themselves in was, you know, really wanting to comply with the Mayor's guidance, and there was no, you know, negligence or ambition to contradict that, versus needing to ensure they get the best outcome of those conversations with government. And so that ultimately is what, you know, the tension that was playing out around that time. I know that the Chief Finance Officer of TfL has written to the Chair of the committee to explain that situation and offered to talk to you personally about it. So hopefully that's a helpful offer. We knew that was happening before the 24th. So it wasn't, you know, it was difficult when it wasn't publishable on the 24th. And, you know, our team is good and able to respond quickly and flexibly when things change. So that's what we've done. Because we have good links into the functional bodies, we were able to get the information that was needed to keep things ticking over. So it wasn't
some information, even though it wasn't publicly published.
Exactly.
You were getting the information. So.
It wasn't a total black hole from our perspective, and we were able to pass some of that information on confidentially to the Secretariat, so that your scrutiny work wasn't hampered too much too. So it is challenging, but it is better to get the right outcome from the conversation with government.
But you were able to share some information. I hadn't been aware of that with our staff for our work.
It was confidential. So the aim is not to hinder scrutiny, but not to jeopardise conversation.
Of course, we understand that. That's lovely. And I think more for TfL, I want to pick up with them about the ridership figures and what they're seeing across industry.
I think that's a good conversation.
I think that the fares income, and there is a shift. I met with South Eastern recently. They're starting to see a shift, even since sort of half term, of people going in more. So it's going to continue to change. So I think we need to tease that out when we get TfL before us. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Harani.
Just wanted some clarity on whether, Elliott, you could spell out, if you like, what the impact is of not getting that £500 million, especially for the Piccadilly line.
So, I mean, there's two ways to talk. The £500 million is an assumption that the government will jointly fund TfL's capital programme. So half TfL, half government, 50-50. So it actually relates to £1 billion of investment. So if you don't get the 500 million, that's £1 billion of investment that is at risk. Not that won't happen, but it is at risk. By far the biggest element of that is investment in the Piccadilly line, rolling stock and signals and tracks. And I think that's around £350 million of the £500 billion. So I think that TfL will be able to talk to you better than I can about the scenario planning that they have in place, depending on the amount of the 500 million that is received. Enver, I can see
just to sort of add to everything Elliott said, there's a health and safety issue, because if we can't afford to do it, then either we do it and then we stop something else. But if you're not investing into your rolling stock, there's health and safety. So it's going to mean that TfL will have to, at times, in order for passenger safety, probably reduce the service, because they'll be running on antiquated rollings, on antiquated stock. There's people who need to build this stuff, so there's jobs that are going to be reliant on it. So not getting it, if TfL doesn't proceed, or doesn't proceed at the pace that they want to, there will be consequential impacts on wider economy and on passenger journeys. And if the lines that are impacted have to be closed at certain points, then it puts more pressure onto other routes, and therefore on other people's passenger journeys. So, but the most important thing to point out is health and safety. I think not the current commissioner, Andy Byford, I remember him saying his utmost priority was health and safety, and he won't gamble with that, and nor would anybody, because it's, you end up being liable for it. So if we don't get the money into TfL, then there's going to have to be some real tough decisions around what bits of the capital programme do they stop.
Okay, and just thinking about, is it to maintain the current level of usage, the investment in the Piccadilly fleet, or are you expecting, let's say, an upturn in ridership as a result of investing in the line? Or I'm just trying to think of a way of, from a finance perspective, is it something that pays for itself in the long term? Or is it just simply fixing what it is from a safety point of view? You
need, I mean, we talked about it with the analogy I used about phones and systems. Something's got to be fit for purpose, and it's about health and safety. It's about being able to continue to provide the service. But if it's reliable and safe, hopefully one of the benefits is it increases ridership too, because people know that they can go to the Piccadilly line and they won't say, oh, I can't use that, because there's certain lines that I sort of think I don't use them because there's always a problem with them. And if I know that a line is safe and works well, I use it more. And I'm assuming that most logical-minded people will do the same on the way to work, whereas people avoid things that they don't think are safe or reliable.
I'm just picking up also on an earlier point made. I think you mentioned about the local government finance update, which confirmed that the mayor can use the, or the government wouldn't resist the £20 council tax levy for TfL. Just some of the language that was used by the Secretary of State. I think it said that it's disappointing that London taxpayers are having to foot the bill for the GLA's poor governance and decision making. Just think from a, let's say, you want to be working with government. Is that kind of language? How does that feel to you in terms of having a constructive, positive relationship with another part of the government or state? And does the GLA suffer from poor governance and decision making?
No, it doesn't. Look, politicians will make their comments, and at official level, we just carry on talking to each other.
Thank you. I'm glad that you're continuing with business as you should.
Well, there's conversations we have with government officials at funding levels. Once they get it, and I know that they get it, having been in their roles before myself, there's only so much they can do. They can't promise more than what they're allowed to do. What all we can do is make sure that they are escalating the issues that we are raising through the right channels within the machinery of government, okay? And that they are giving the right explanations as to what the cause of those gaps are. They've fulfilled their duties once they've done that. As I said at the beginning of this meeting, the government has a number of priorities that it needs to meet. In our world, what we talk about is very, very high priorities, and we believe that. If you're on the other side of the table, they've got umpteen requests coming from all over the country and overseas on the same pot of money. What I don't buy is when it gets down to officials, where they're being accused of not running the organisation properly. That's not political, that's slander, and it's not true. TfL has not been mismanaged. This mayor's done a good job with it, and current TfL administration has done a really good job with the savings they've done, keeping the show on the road. So it's nothing to do with mismanagement. It is, they were asked to run an organisation, a full service through the pandemic when there was no journeys. If you kept shops open when there was no customers, would the government have been asked to cover the cost? If they were told to keep it open, then I'd expect people to go back to the government with a bill. That's all this is. I'm not seeing mismanagement of, in my professional opinion, I've not seen mismanagement of it.
Thank you.
I don't see any other indications on Transport for London. That being the case, we'll take a short 10-minute comfort break before we return to look at policing. Hello and welcome back to the second half of this morning's Budget and Performance Committee, looking at the GLA Group Budget. The next... We seem to have a strange disembodied voice joining us. Sorry, what?
You need to talk to IT, because this is being broadcast to that message that just came across.
Yes.
Presumably just been broadcast, unless they didn't notice that you banged the gavel. So you need IT to confirm that we're broadcast.
I've contacted them.
So we are ready to resume. And do we know who that was or what that message was? Okay, well, we'll leave that to them separately and we will resume with our bits and pieces. We have Assembly Member Russell, who's now going to be looking at policing budgets.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm wondering, police questions, is that for you, Elliott? Great, thank you. So same question as was asked about TfL, actually, about outlining the circumstances behind the late publication of MOPAC's 24-25 budget submission. At what stage were you informed the submission would be late, and what has been the impact of the delay on the budget consolidation process?
Hello, and thanks for the question. It's a similar answer, really. So we have good relationships with functional bodies, including MOPAC, and so we've been talking to them and knew what stage they were at in developing their budget. The specific circumstances around MOPAC are different to TfL. Everyone's different, and they've had some very senior turnover in their finance function, notably their CFO. So they had a new CFO arrive in, I think, sort of early summertime, and that just had knock-on consequences for their budget process, which by that point ordinarily would have been sort of well in swing, but the new CFO arrived and needed to understand the context, design their own process that suited and so on. So it just had a bit of a knock-on consequence that led to the whole thing going back a few weeks. We were cited on the stage that they were at throughout that, so none of that was terribly surprising. We didn't know exactly when their submission was going to be published. We knew that it might be late. We didn't, it was published on Tuesday of the following week. We didn't know 2 weeks before it was going to be Tuesday of the following week, but we knew that it might be a bit late. And we tried to keep Secretariat in the loop as we get new information about when it might or might not be published, but we weren't privy to that information in advance that it would be exactly on that date. As with TfL, they were able to share information with us on a confidential basis to allow us to continue our work before they were in the position to publish. So, to mitigate any risk that it hampered our ability to pull together the consultation budget. So that was helpful and welcome, and allowed us to, do what we would otherwise have been doing anyway, as far as was possible.
Thank you. And so then, what do you see as the most significant financial risk to the MOPAC MPS 2024-25 budget plans?
So there's two ways of answering that. The most significant risk is one that has existed for several years, which is the systemic underfunding from the government of the National International Cities Capital Grant. So many years ago, in 2015-16, that was estimated to be an amount by an independent review by Switch Mottram. The funding that the Met receive is, in cash terms, £159 million less than that review said. If you account for inflation, according to MOPAC's latest stats, that's now equivalent to £240 million in today's cash terms. So that's a significant gap in the money that they receive according to the activity that they are expected to undertake.
And that's because of this was the National
and International Capital Cities Grant. So that's the central government pot that is used to compensate primarily London, but some money also goes to Manchester for activity that they undertake, which is a consequence of being a major city. So in London, the royal family is situated in London, Parliament is, lots of protests and so on happen in London.
Coronations.
Coronations, yeah.
Funerals.
So that's a structural risk that has existed in the Met's budget for many years now. In the specific risks attached to 2024-25, so you'll have seen in the figures that are published, there's a budget gap in 24-25, £54 million. So just balancing the books, and by budget gap, the books balance, but there's a line in there which I can't remember specifically what it's called, but there's a line that assumes additional savings which need to be achieved to make that balance in 24-25, and that's worth £54 million based on the figures that MOPAC published last Tuesday. So that's a meaningful sum of money that needs to be found from somewhere to make the 24-25 budget balance, and that's a risk.
So it's a risk. What are the options for filling that risk? I mean,
so you can fill it two ways, can't you? By finding more income from somewhere or reducing your spending somewhere. The mayor has more direct control over one of those than the other, and that's the income, but that's constrained by what the government allow the mayor to do. And so, as you talked about at length with Enver, there's constraints about what the mayor can do on business rates and council tax that limit the amount of income that he can raise to help plug that £54 million gap. When the police provisional funding settlement is published, could be any day now, that will give us more information about the income that's available to the mayor to help him plug that gap. So, as at this stage every year, it's frustratingly incomplete, the information we can provide you, because those settlements haven't yet been published. And the other way you can plug it is by finding new savings. That's challenging. The Met have already delivered over £1 billion in savings since 2012-13, I think, and have quite a substantial savings target already built into 24-5. So finding £54 million additional savings on top of the over £100 million savings they've budgeted for so far will be challenging. Yeah. So that £54 million is the risk.
And so, yes, we have to hope that that the income side is as healthy as possible. Okay. So then MOPAC and the Met have a history of under-delivery of the capital programme. So what do you see as the main challenges to delivery, and what advice would you give MOPAC and the MPS to enable them to spend and monitor capital budgets more effectively?
So on the premise of your question, it's undeniable. So the MOPAC and the Met's capital programme has a history of underspending against budget. It's important to remember with capital programmes that slippage is different to underspend, and capital is lumpy in a way that revenue spending isn't. So capital programmes can slip because of one significant purchase being delayed, one significant project being postponed and turning it from one financial year to another. So, that context needs to be borne in mind when looking at the under-delivery in the MOPAC and Met capital programme. That said, the stats do speak for themselves. If you look at the capital figures published in last Tuesday's document, their capital programme for future years is around, plateaus at about £250 million a year, assumed spend for 2025-6 onwards, I think. That is far more consistent with their historic outturn than has been the case in the past. So it looks like, we know that they've done a very thorough job of developing their capital programme this year. And it looks like that programme has taken account of historic learnings about what they're able to get out of the door, rather than setting an aspirational capital budget, setting a realistic capital budget in line with historical outturns. So that's reassuring to see. The final thing I'd mention on capital is estates is an enormous part of the Met's capital programme, and the estates programme is currently still in development stage, and I know it's been in development stage for a long time, and you've been waiting for the state strategy for a while. The arrival of the new commissioner and his transformation programme has changed the needs for the Met from the state's perspective, and those cogs are still turning in the background. So I think that's an important thing to remember when thinking about the Met's capital programme, and possibly something that you'll talk about with them.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Russell. Sticking with policing budget, we have a supplementary question from Assemblymember Duval and Assemblymember Desai.
Look, on the capital programme, isn't the issue from the centre in budget making is getting the MPS to stick to a capital programme and stop the different priorities with every different commissioner, or actually almost, it sounds like every year, something is different. I don't understand some of the long-term issues of direction of travel around that capital programme. So I just wanted to make that on the back of that, but more importantly too, from our perspective as we enter into this budget process, okay, I get the bit about unfair spending. I am pro-police expenditure. I hope during this budget process that we focus on the outcomes of that police expenditure. But one of the issues around trying to maximise our money in, have we, in terms of from the centre, at this stage of the budget process, we've made representations around NIC funding and all the rest of it, but have we begun to make the case, I think it was alluded to earlier, in writing to government about that we could do more with some flexibility of some of that money in providing policing outcomes? That crime fighters are not just police officers, they are not. So what is the role, in terms of the GLA Group budget making, of actually reinforcing, so I'm hoping you're going to tell me the MPS have been doing that, and you have been following and supporting it here at the centre, because it makes sense for the GLA Group budget. What representations are we making around that flexibility? I know it's relatively new, and the Commissioner has started that, but what have we done officially, officials to officials?
Can I clarify what you mean by flexibility? Do you mean the flexibility to raise money through council tax, or the flexibility for how the money is used?
Flexibility to say, actually, yeah, police officers are important, but if we can't recruit them and we redeployed that money onto something else, we can give still a greater policing outcome. That sort of flexibility.
Understood. So I think related to your question might be the money the government, central government, has provided for the police officer uplift. So the Met were allocated an uplift number. I think it was 4,550 something officers, and are doing well to recruit against that target, but didn't manage to deliver it in the time that the government have set. There was funding attached to that recruitment target. As it wasn't achieved at the time the government would have liked, there was a reduction in the grant that was provided corresponding to the shortfall of recruitment compared to that target. So that reduced the income available to the Met. From one perspective, those officers weren't in place, so those costs weren't incurred. So to a certain extent, it nets off, and that's how it plays out in the finance tables. So the costs aren't there, nor are the income. But obviously, it would be beneficial to have that income rather than not have it. I know that the Met are frequently in conversation with the government about that, but those conversations are something you'd need to ask the Met about, not us, or MOPAC about, not us. That's all I can give you on that, I'm afraid.
But shouldn't we, at this case, I know we leave it to Met and MOPAC, but there is an argument in the GLA Group in terms of funding. We're funding some money that's helping the preventative side of funding out the GLA Group. Well, I think that gives us, we have an executive mayor who's also the Police and Crime Commissioner. It gives us the power to add the voice to officials that we need a different case maybe a different policing model. I want more police officers, don't get me wrong. But if that isn't happening in that way, then I want to see resources deployed in tackling crime. I don't want to see them being not used, and in some way it hurts me when we have to give money back that we can't use. Are we in a position to do that? And I think the GLA Group Budget, part of this process as we go forward, is about us making the case for the use of that money in delivering the GLA stroke MPS objectives. I don't see them as different objectives. We all want to see reduced crime here in the capital. Discuss.
I mean, the mayor.
So where are you on this, gentlemen?
The mayor did put that forward in his request for the autumn statement around having more flexibility and sustainable resources. We have in the GLA probably a direct relationship with about 12, I counted about 12 different government departments or agencies. When I joined, having been in the Cabinet Office, I said we're not doing this right because we're not, with all due respect to the relationships that exist, if your voice doesn't get heard in the circle where the real decisions are made, which is that inner core of Treasury, then actually you get empathy and sympathy from the departments that you're talking to. So everyone thinks they've made the representation, but it doesn't make its way to the centre of the Treasury in a way that is more than one line on a spreadsheet. And that needs to keep improving, but we need to build at official level a direct link into the Treasury without being disrespectful to colleagues in the Home Office or DLUC or department formerly known as BAYS, because they then talk to their Treasury spending team, who then talk to the core Treasury spending team, and we're lucky if it's a line on a spreadsheet. So this doesn't get heard. So the only person who's got the mic is the mayor, because he's got that media outlet where he can make these comments, but then they come across as political, and when political is not aligned, it doesn't get heard. But actually at official level, you know, it was quite late when we found out that in GLA that money got sent back. Yeah. And it sticks in the throat, because we're saying, well, hold on a minute, we asked for this money and then we're giving it back. Why are we giving it back? Oh, we didn't meet the criteria. Well, didn't we challenge that if we knew we couldn't recruit? So yeah, there are some things I think internally at official level we need to look at. Well, how do we get that so we find out about that? It's very rare that we have to give money back, but there's something more recently I've discovered in another part of the forest that we're also giving back. And it does stick in the throat, because you think, but it comes with such tight criteria, and that's not just to London, across the nation, and they're not going to do us a special deal in London. They say, look, we give this money out with this criteria, you've got to spend it. And so it doesn't, it's difficult, but, you know, I do think we should have flexibility.
I do think that, but we need to then be asking for that and making those representations at different levels. So I realise, in the grown-up world we live in, you report to the mayor and you will raise issues to the mayor. I suppose my plea is to make sure we're battling on every front about the use of this money. I don't want to see it being used frivolously or even wasted in some ways. Of the old days of when I was in local government, you had to spend up to that budget or you'd lose it, and some expenditure probably wasn't used wisely. But I do think there are things that should. But equally, in this budget process, the fact that we have a group budget, I recognise passionately about devolution, about the MPS and MOPAC, but there are some things in the group budget that where they need to be held to account and to play as a group does. And there is some power in a number of voices on this, consistently asking or inquiring about that change when it's for the benefit of all Londoners and London organisations. Both GLA, MOPAC and the MPS should be united around this, and you shouldn't be left short. Chair, if I can move on very quickly. My next one is this. Again, I'm into tough love of the policing, but, you know, and we've got a real opportunity in terms of budget scrutiny here to get down to some very key issues within policing. So their budget performance and value for money. Now, I'm saying it from someone who cares about policing issues, but I do think we've lost sight of this over the years. Now, unless you officials here at the centre start asking questions around some of that value for money aspect, then we will continue on the same. I think this committee is probably more united about asking those questions, not in terms of undermining the police, not to cut the money in some ways, but to use it effectively in dealing with tackling crime. Now, I think some parts are being used effectively. What I don't understand is that that can't be shown to me. And that worries me, because that then tells me there's sections that are probably not using it effectively or being held to account about the use of that money. How best then can you use your roles here at the centre to put that into it? And hopefully the executive should be asking these questions, because it would be a question that I would be asking if I was in their position. So what's the best way forward as we enter? I know we're up against it and things are starting to, you know, we're dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but where can we get this value for money concept, budget performance, to reassure members that we are investing our money on the right outcomes, which is reducing crime, bringing people to book for their actions when they're threatening in our communities?
We'll give you a quick two-part answer, because Elliott was in that space before, so he can give a more detailed answer. But there's two parts to it. One was when the latest policing crime plan was came out, and I was on my outcomes mission. I worked very closely with MOPAC to make sure that the new pack was more outcomes focused. And actually, we had a really good relationship when Elliott was on the other side of the fence, when he was there, and with the performance team. And that pack was designed. Now, the police themselves, the Mets, they have to produce a performance pack that is consistent with other police authorities up and down the land, which is what the Home Office wants. So we couldn't dismiss that, nor could we say to them, do two lots. So what we did was we said, okay, you carry on having all your normal stats, like response times to 999 calls and all of that, that still exists. But we put a veneer over the top around outcomes and said, what things feed into these outcomes? And so that, for a year at least, the performance packs that they produced were on that basis. And the conversations that we have, so David Bellamy and I, would have with MOPAC were based around that performance pack and talking about things like value for money. In addition to that, more recently, under the new Met for London, there's been a new governance and a policing board, but there's also a finance committee that's been created, and that finance committee will also receive a pack, and that they will be asking questions on what the police is actually doing with its resources. So in some ways that's been delegated to that new independent board to challenge, which I don't think, although there's been scrutiny of the police, I think that's another level of scrutiny that perhaps hasn't existed before. So the police board will, the finance committee of that police board will be going into that level of granularity, and will have to clear what they're doing with their money. I'm sure over time it will actually start to make a real difference to what's happening on the ground, but they will have more time and energy to focus all their questioning in addition to what David and I do centrally. I don't know if Elliott wants to add any more detail.
No, I would have said exactly the same. There's a real opportunity with the London Policing Board to expose that kind of scrutiny.
Well, I look forward to that, because that's probably the first I realised that that was going to happen. But we must remember it's an advisory board in terms of that. Unless the executive wants to change, it's going to be the executive that run it. My final question, Chair, I've taken too much time. MOPAC. Right, again, I am a great supporter of MOPAC, but I do not understand, post-Casey review, why we never reviewed MOPAC in terms of the money spent, but also outcomes, but about the direction that we want MOPAC to be operating under the new regime or discussion post-Casey about policing services around that. Equally, there are elements of Metropolitan Police Service funding, and there are elements of GLA funding now that are coalescing around that, and some of the budget changes that you're proposing around themes, I presume we get to understand that a little bit more about how money operates. Well, will it? I'm not sure, because we still might see the GLA money in its silos versus other MPS money in its silos? Will they ever come together that we can look at them in its total? I'm not sure. But shouldn't we be looking at all this money and saying, is it still fit for purpose of what we want to do for the coming years, given the changes going on? And again, shouldn't we be here at the centre? Shouldn't you be saying to the executive, I accept they don't agree with what you always say or ask, but shouldn't you be putting out to the executive saying, you need to look at this, you need to look at this within this budget process if you want to set direction of travel around some of these activities? You can argue for other activities, but I'm focusing on policing at the moment because it's about time we return to it.
There's two themes that we've come up with 10 themes.
Yeah.
There's two that are not in this round,
Yep.
because they belong in the functional bodies. One is safety, one's transport. By default, the nature of what those organisations do falls into those themes. So by default, they are going to be operating in those themes, but not in 24-25. During 24-25, assuming that what we do in the GLA works well, and the approach that we've taken works well, we'd like to expand that across the rest of the group. In doing so, if we apply the process that I've alluded to, but I haven't gone into too much detail on the themes, where we start looking at outcomes, logic chains, theories of change, it would then take an organisation and it would look almost like zero-based budgeting, but it would look at all these inputs and outputs and to what end are the outcomes being achieved. We're not at that point with MOPAC, so I don't want to speak out of turn, but if this works well, then I'm hoping that we will be engaging with them. At the same time, yes, there's been a change of commissioner. He's got his agenda. There's been the Casey review. There's a new Met for London. He wants to transform it. There's some within the budget and there's some outside the budget he wants money for. So I'm assuming he's also doing this stuff and he wants to prioritise his funds and his resources towards the things that matter. Not to get too political, but he has at least two masters. One is the Home Secretary and one is the Mayor. And then actually you have the public who are saying what they think. That's really an internal governance issue for them, but I'm hoping this new police board and the subsequent subcommittees will challenge. And I think, you know, these are probably some questions to ask for the Mayor himself on the 9th of January, but I'm assuming that he will have oversight of that, and then we'd need to look at how this committee scrutiny process has sight of what's going on in there as well. But I know there's never enough money to give to the police to do everything they want. We've all got our opinions when we look at what they're spending their time on, if it's the right sort of time. But I'm confident the Commissioner's probably looking at all of this in the round, because he just doesn't have enough money to go around, so he's trying to make it stretch to meet every demand that he's got.
Yeah, just finally to you, really, it's something. It's for you to consider. Really, there's an opportunity there that we look and maybe realign some of our scrutiny activities to look and coincide with the future safety theme of where that comes in. That we may be able to influence it as it's coming together. Secondly, we really do need to think about how our relationship back with the Police and Crime Committee and this Budget Committee, because we can only deal with some strategic big items, and I think we have, and we should be, I think we've done well over the years, but there are some detail stuff on financing that we might need a new deal within the London Assembly about how we do some financial scrutiny. It's just to consider. I'm not saying I've got the option on it, but if we're to help and support the services in a way that it just might be a time for us to think of what changes we make around scrutiny around. And given that the Metropolitan Police can't decide whether they're coming to us or not coming to us, depending on which day of the week it is, well, we know the senior officers don't want to come to us. This gives us an opportunity to think about that scrutiny at this level.
I agree. Let me just, Assembly Member Desai in a moment. I've been itching to come in for about the last 20 minutes.
Some time, but there we are.
Yes. Let me just a quick observation on this police uplift programme. So about what was foresight and what was hindsight. So firstly, we were the only police force in the country that didn't meet the police uplift programme. So I just want to be clear that, you know, it was only the Met that failed to meet the government 4,500 that were offered, or whatever proportionately others were offered. So 2 years ago, as a shiny new Assembly member, first few months in the job, I sat on this committee, and December 2021, and we were looking at some figures that told us that the government had offered 4,500 police officers. The Mayor thought he needed 6,000. There was a sort of artificial black hole in the Met budget created by that. I challenged the practicality of being able to recruit that many officers, whether it was realistic, whether that was actually something that could or would happen, because I didn't think that it would happen. So it's not entirely just hindsight. That discussion, then the leader of the Labour group intervened and sort of suggested that I was doing down London and not trying to get us as many police officers as we would like. And I would just like to suggest that perhaps if I'd been listened to at the time, this discussion that apparently was not happening internally about whether we would recruit all those officers, it was not just hindsight. Some of us got there 2 years ago about the realism of the plan that was on the table to recruit 6,000 officers that the Mayor said he needed. Assembly Member Desai, who has been waiting very patiently, and then Assembly Member Harani.
Chair, can I, well, firstly, the debate about the Police Advisory Board, because that's what I would call it, and some colleagues, I'll leave it for another time and another place, because I could go on all afternoon. Secondly, can I just comment on what you just said? The figure of 6,000 police officers wasn't plucked out of thin air by the Mayor. It was the Mayor and the ex-police commissioner, using a professional experience and knowledge, who actually came to that figure. The Assembly itself passed a resolution that I proposed calling for 5,000. 5,000, 6,000, every single police officer, extra officer helps. And of course, London has got there's a unique situation. The Mets had a battering in recent times, police morale, but the cost of living crisis, particularly affecting London, I think that's a major factor. So you can't just sort of say that the Met has failed and other forces have succeeded. There are unique factors to London. But coming back to the theme of this meeting, and something that Assemblyman Duval has already said, and using his words, battling on all fronts, and what you said, the Mayor and his media outlets, very specifically about NIC, the National International Capital City Grant, something that we've been banging the drum about ever since I've been here in 2016, and I'm sure before that. The Assembly's passed motions, getting support from all parties. The Mayor's written to the government numerous times. What's the latest thinking, if any, from the officers that civil service that you deal with at the Home Office about where we are with our campaign, with our representations? Everyone accepts. I mean, it's a scandal that the way the Met is underfunded when it comes to NIC, National International Capital City Grant, and especially in recent weeks with all the marches every weekend, enormous drain on police resources.
I mean, I'll let Elliott come into any specifics that he's aware of from his police days, but it's recognised, nobody's denying it. And the most recent costs of protests in the capital are evidence of that if the Met had this money, then they'd be funded to cover these protests. We are the capital city of the UK. Let's be realistic about this. And the Mayor, at every opportunity that he gets to write to the Chancellor, the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister, always brings it up. One thing we should be doing now is updating it and saying what Elliott said earlier, which is it's not 159 anymore. That was then.
Yeah, it's
we'll bring it up today in today's terms. We're probably talking about 240, in which case the police gap's completely gone. So we're not giving up on it. There's no signs of a new finance commission, but if there was such a thing, I'm positive it would be back on the table again. It's never off the table. But when you talk to officials, even if officials were to informally agree that they think you're right, it's not their choice.
Well, I know. Yeah.
And it's
a political
that's
decision.
always, it's political, so we cannot ask them for any more than just to say, do you acknowledge it? And my understanding is they recognise it, but no one's ever in writing confirmed that they'll give it. So I don't know, Elliott, if there's anything more you're aware of.
Yeah, I'd add one thing. Well, I'd make a clarification. Enver referred to my police days. I wasn't a police officer. I used to work at MOPAC. I'm on secondment to the GLA from MOPAC. An important thing to bear in mind when thinking about the NIC is that from the Home Office's perspective, their higher priority is the police funding formula and the government's manifesto commitment to revise the police funding formula before the end of this Parliament. Now, obviously, that now looks extremely ambitious. But if the Home Office are thinking about police funding, the thing they first think about is revisions to the police funding formula, not changing the NIC and topping up London's NIC, notwithstanding what Enver said, which is true, which, you know, official conversations do recognise this issue. But yeah, so, you know, if the Home Office are working on police funding, they're working on the funding formula, and even that seems to have stalled, as far as we know. So right back at the start of 2023, there was a burst of activity, and we were led to believe at an officer level that there might be a consultation launched soon. We've not heard anything since then. So that's... and the funding formula revision comes with downside risks for London's police funding rather than upside risks. So I think that that's important to bear in mind when we talk about how much progress we're making on the NIC. That's not what the Home Office are thinking about.
Assembly Member Harani.
So I just want to get some clarification on the money that was sent back to government based on not being able to recruit the 4,600 fully. Is that money that's lost forever? Because at any point has there been conversations to say, okay, we couldn't do it within this time frame for these reasons that Assembly Member Desai mentioned in terms of London's particular challenges, but is there something in that conversation to say, okay, but we feel it is possible to do it within an alternative time frame, or was it computer says no after a certain cut-off date?
So the money's gone back, so the money is no longer there. That's important to recognise, and it's, you know, always easier to keep money when you've already got it in your wallet. The conversations are not over. So I think that's an important conversation to have with MOPAC when you sit with them. So Enver and I aren't involved in every exchange that happens between MOPAC, the MPS and the Home Office, but I know that those conversations aren't over. So I think that, you know, while I'm not able, not through any sort of covertness, I'm not able to give you a firm answer, I think that's something you might pick up with MOPAC.
Okay, we'll take that up separately then.
Okay, I don't see any other indications on police budgeting, so that takes us on to our next section, which is London Fire Brigade with Assembly Member Clark.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Sort of carrying on with a bit of a theme, as with most institutions, about 80% of LFB's budget is spent on staff. Given that context, how realistic is it that the LFB can afford that 3% pay rise?
So they've budgeted for it in 24/5, and they have a balanced budget. So that, from a finance perspective, is fine. But there are risks attached. So they've balanced their budget in 24/5. Included in balancing their budget in 24/5 is quite a substantial drawdown on reserves. So they're drawing down about 20 million on reserves, which is several million more than they've done in 23/4. So, you know, reserves have helped fund that 3% assumption for pay, just by the arithmetic of it. Reserves obviously are finite and they run out over time, so there are risks attached to funding ongoing expenditure through reserve funding. And there are budget gaps in 25/6 and 6/7, so nearly 6 million in 5/6 and rising to just over 16 million in the year after that. So, you know, they've balanced their budget. That's the most important thing. They've done it using reserves, and there are gaps in the following years, and those gaps are more than the cost of the additional percentage point. So, to a certain extent, if that percentage point wasn't there, the gaps would be still there. And I think the other thing to recognise is that the bigger pressure, bigger than the cost of the 3% pay rise, is the training costs that they've built into their budget. So they're about £10 million a year for the next 2 years. And they're also funding from reserves, but those reserves will eventually run out, and the training doesn't stop. So that's, that's a risk as well. So, that's the context that I would give to the LFB finance numbers. Your question about whether it's realistic to assume that that's affordable is a good one, but another question is it realistic to assume a 2% pay rise if we don't think that that's going to happen? So if you were to do that, not make an allowance for a higher than 2% pay rise, but you in your heart knew that it was going to be higher, probably going to be higher. All you've done is introduced an unbudgeted risk, in-year risk, that kicks the problem down the road, and then you would find yourself scrabbling around to make that money available when the inevitable incurred. So the LFB were making a difficult trade-off when they were deciding on their pay assumption, and I think there is a logic for what they've done.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it goes on to a very much related to the previous conversation we were having about police and the cost of living, and particularly in London. When I had an email, actually yesterday, an unprompted email, and to my council email address, so I don't think the person necessarily knew I had any association with the London Assembly, but they were saying that they're a firefighter and their rent has gone up from $2,000 a month to $2,500 a month. So these are obviously big gaps that our firefighters and all workers in London are facing.
Could I just come on to one thing, though, just to add on to what Elliott said? I think what he might have missed out on, though, is the mayor does allocate all of the increase of the council tax that isn't hypothecated to the police and the £20 TFO, all of it goes to the LFB. So when you talk about the 3%, we've given them the money for that, and they get money from the central government as well. Where LFB choose to put their money elsewhere, they can't then come back and say, but you didn't give us the money for the pay, because we did, right? So we've covered that 2% and the 3%. If they've chose to spend it on other running costs, then they might have to rethink how they've done that. I'm not saying they haven't got pressures, but actually we do look after them quite well. In fact, if I look at the group, I think we look after them the most, because all of the council tax increase, apart from the base, always goes to the fire brigade. Apart from the police, which we don't have any choice, we've got to give it to them. But government's got a central responsibility in this too. And, not to allude too much as to what might happen in the future, the mayor usually does try and find the money for the pay awards as well, for when he thinks he has a greater responsibility for a particular area than when he thinks it's central government's responsibility. I'm not quite sure where he draws the line with the fire brigade, but he does. We have topped them up. I don't want to say too much more because we don't know where the pay settlements are going to go, but LFB were in a better negotiating position on the pay awards for the current year than the other fire authorities, and they had to move in synchronisation and keep their powder dry, but they had enough money to sort out the pay deal, but they had to wait for the other authorities who didn't have a generous mayor to give them the same money to be able to end that deal. So we don't think 2% is realistic. We've put more than that into the GLA, so we are expecting, and they haven't covered that in their budget. In their budget submission, they haven't gone above that. They've gone up to what they think they can afford. So as Elliott said, yes, they've balanced, but balanced what? Are they going to settle on 2%? I don't think so. So at some point in this round, there's going to be an ask for more money, and it's recurring because it doesn't go away. And that's the other point Elliott said. What LFB are doing is they're drawing down on their reserves for stuff, and they need to make sure they're drawing down on reserves for one-offs, not for recurring. Otherwise, they're creating a problem later on. And what's the assumption about who's going to pick up the tab later on?
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, I think we have seen certainly our mayor topping up the budget to the London Fire Brigade, which is desperately needed, especially given our built environment in London, which has some unique characteristics. So thank you for that, and thank you, Chair.
I had an indication from Assemblymember Rogers on Fire Brigade.
Thank you. Just a quick question. When the LFB are assessing potential future spending, are you happy that they have effective financial controls in place? So robust business case assessment, good cost-benefit analysis, that sort of thing?
I can say with certainty now, yes. I can't say with certainty in the past they had that, but their current CFO has created an investment board, and they do look at business cases, and there is a lot of internal scrutiny now. So I know that under the current fire commissioner, he's really revamped his top team, and there's a lot more of that's happening. They've still got some building to do in their finance function because there's people that are retiring and there's some churn, but the processes are much more robust than they were a couple of years ago.
That's good to hear. When did the investment board, when was that created?
I think it was about a year ago. that I was told about it. So the current CFO started just over a year ago, and one of the first things he did was create this quality assurance process and to ask for business cases.
That's reassuring. And you say they have some building to do in their team. How would you characterise that? What are the gaps that they have?
Well, I think it's just they've got people that have been there for a long time and then they're retiring, and so I think they need to make sure that knowledge isn't lost. And also there's a culture change in the organisation that's happening, and I think that you need to modernise the finance function too. So I think they need new systems, new processes, and people that can build that capability with them. It's not a criticism of the people they've got now, but in terms of the new LFB that they want to be, they're on the same journey as the rest of the group. There's, I think there's just improvement in the finance functions that is slowly evolving.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other indications on Fire Brigade, which takes us then to our final topic, which is the two mayoral development corporations, starting with Assemblymember Pigeon and the London Legacy Development Corporation.
I take it this is with you as well, Elliott, is it?
Emma might help.
Okay, okay.
Sorry, Emma might
I
help.
really want to focus on the £550 million loan to LLDC. What are the risks around recovery of that? And actually probably linked to that, I think I'll link my other question, because obviously it's capped currently at 550 million, this loan. But actually, East Bank, we heard very clearly yesterday, is going over and over its budget, 95 million over the last 2 years, though not quite all of that, about 9 off that is for the GLA to be worrying about. So they may have to increase their borrowing. So what are the options there? And how concerned are you about this?
So just to clarify, the 550 isn't a borrowing amount, it's a borrowing limit. So it's how much they are allowed as an organisation. It's a cap. The LLDC gets its money, either some of it from grants from us, there might be some central government money, there's contributions from the other parties that are involved on the site, and then of course once they start building and selling things, there's capital receipts that pay for it. I'm more concerned now than I was a year ago. You were told very clearly yesterday from all of the different organisations that were there what the risks are in the sector, so I don't need to repeat all of that. It's scary what's going on, and I don't have a crystal ball. At the moment, the way I look at it is when we're topping up with grants, we're just helping to cash roll it, and that at some point they will sell those assets and they will pay us back. So the reason why they had the shortfall this year is it's a commercially sensitive issue, but there was a particular asset that was going to be sold for a certain amount of money that would have plugged that gap this year, and the purchaser took advantage of the current market and made a substantially lower bid. And so LLDC could have taken that bid and we could have given them less grant, or they could hold on to the asset and wait till the market picks up again and sell it and get the right money. So by giving them the grant this year, it gives them the opportunity to basically hold out a bit longer till they get a better offer.
I mean, I get their finances. It's longer term. They're going to have the estate charge coming in as more is built, and as you say, it's all about cash flow, really. But given East Bank is so over budget, and as we heard yesterday, you know, the contracts that have been set up mean the risk completely falls to the LLDC. What will happen if they need more?
We have to find it.
And do you have reserves in order to be able to do that?
I've had to, as the CFO, I've had to underwrite their risk, which is not comfortable, as we do with most of our subsidiaries. And, you know, I might not call them a subsidiary, but we do fund them. We have to help them get these projects completed. And as long as they are doing everything they can, as you heard what Lynn and Jerry said yesterday, they're really negotiating on it. There's quite unique circumstances around that East Bank development, because each one of those buildings is different. You know, you've got museums, galleries, university halls, BBC studios, theatres. They're not typical blocks of flats that you can just say, well, you should have known that. They've got acoustics in buildings. I've actually gone to the site a couple of times just to understand it, and I get it, because I've probably been critical internally about why didn't you know these costs were going to happen. But they faced lots and lots of challenges, and unfortunately every single one of them has gone south. It's that there's not been one thing that's gone in their favour.
You're underwriting it all, but are you also going to do some learning for the group in terms of sort of contracts that are set up in future? Because somebody must have signed this off at some point and said, yes, this was going to be a good deal. And when it opens, everyone will forget and everyone will think it's fantastic, like they do with everything. And that's fine. But actually, at the moment, we've got to learn from this, because this is a huge risk, which the GLA ultimately is taking.
Yeah, I mean, not to undermine how wonderful what they're doing is what they're doing, but look, let's not. There are some contracts that were signed many, many years ago that LLDC are dealing with that raises eyebrows. Yeah. And when I joined, I thought they were joking when I found out about some of the contracts that LLDC have inherited.
What year was the East Bank signed off? Do you recall?
I don't know.
Are you able to let us know? Because I think it'd be interesting to work out when it was signed. I mean, I know there was a real pressure to put stuff out there. We had Smithsonian interested at one point, and then that all filtered away. It'd be interesting to understand when it was signed and the sort of pressure.
Yeah, I mean, what I've got is a model of what they were assuming was going to be the surplus back in 2016, and how that has changed over the years when factors have changed. Of course, you've had the affordable housing has increased, and that changes the revenues that you can expect from receipts. But it's gradually been depleted. But costs have gone up. Costs have significantly gone up. You know, the price of steel's gone up, labour's gone up, and that's not unique to what LLDC has had. They've got their specific things that they've said yesterday, but the cost of construction is really going up. And I mentioned it in one of the other panels I was in front of, that actually I think construction inflation is now outstripping energy and all of the rest of it.
Well, they thought it had sort of plateaued, I think they said yesterday, but Okay, thank you. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, somebody was just saying a second. I was just on this point about the contracts. Are we talking about a situation where, you know, with the Olympics, let's say, obviously this is the Olympic site, there's a lot of, how would I put it, exuberance, optimism, and perhaps some of these committees, these panels, these decision-making processes need a sort of Eeyore-ish, you know, grumpy pessimist in there saying, what if, just to inject some, I would say, realism, perhaps you might say, you know, negativity, but sometimes that's it. I mean, was it a lack of that? Is that why we've ended up with this sort of situation?
I think if you look at what surpluses were calculated back in that 2016 model, which would have obviously been produced before 2016, the economy was in a different place, and the amount of surplus that was assumed, even if we were a bit Eeyore-ish about it, you would have said, but look at the margins. It's still win-win. It still was 2-3 years ago when I joined. I was thinking, okay, the surplus isn't what it was. I understood where it had got to, but there was still plenty of margin. But they've come through the pandemic, the cost of all this, without repeating everything they said yesterday, it's just all gone wrong. Okay. And I asked the question as well about, is it scope creep? Have people been adding stuff on? They haven't. They haven't. It's still, it's what it was. It's just some of the design issues that Jerry had explained weren't perhaps calculated as well as maybe one, not because they did anything wrong, but why weren't these things known? And so the lessons are going to be learnt in that when we do OPDC, I'm not expecting there to be the equivalent of the East Bank, but I'm hoping that some of that knowledge transfer will happen from LLDC to OPDC so that we learn from that.
Okay. I don't want to take up too much more time on that. Assembly Member Desai, you want to come in?
11.2 million pounds of the revenue grant is for the London Stadium. Now, if we had a sponsor for the stadium, that would go some way towards actually helping, you know, remedy the situation. Do you know where we are with naming rights? We've been asking this question since 2016, and last time LLDC were here, the person who was with Lingana, I forget his name, I think it was one of the finance guys, he actually, which I thought was a mistake, said that they're looking for around, and I hope I'm right, for around £2 million, and you don't actually give, you know, show your bargaining your cards in public. I mean, and I know that there were people who thought that was a good price for them. But I digress. So where are we with I know there are people who have actually made inquiries. There's been some press speculation, but do you have any idea where we are with naming rights?
I do know where we are, but I can't tell you here.
Okay.
So they're in the middle of negotiations, but they're talking to West Ham.
Yeah, that intrigued me.
And West Ham need to be involved in that, so that it's a freeway negotiation going on at the moment, and I can't say anything more than that.
So, yeah, that did intrigue me, because I did read about this. And this is not having to go at West Ham at all, right? But as Andrew Boffman said, that it's going to be established who owns the stadium. And of course, part of the issue is that the ex-mayor, and again, this is going to go at West Ham, signing of the deal of the century, £2 million or something is what West Ham pay. But why West Ham? Surely it's between LLDC and the potential sponsor? Yeah, well, West Ham are the tenants. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated. So all I'm saying is that there's more parties. It's moved on
for 99 years.
LLDC have moved things forward. They've done what they said they were going to do.
Okay. No, I hope something does work out.
They have still got to make sure all parties that are involved have a say, and they reach a negotiation.
Yeah.
I can't say anything more.
Okay, that's fine.
Than that.
And to be absolutely clear, I wish West Ham well. It's my second team.
We will watch this space. That sounds very exciting. I don't see any other indications, so that takes us to Assembly Member Rogers for the Old Oak Common and Park Royal Development Corporation.
Thanks, Chair. Enver, could you walk us through the GLA's process for setting the level of funding for OPDC?
So OPDC for the last 8 years has been a small little outfit with a very small budget, and it's just rolled over from one year to the next until we got to the current year. When we were setting the current year, the then management team came to myself and the Mayor's office with a target operating model, and that target operating model included an uplift of additional staff to take the organisation that was then into the next phase of delivery, and they asked for some funding, additional funding, to cover the cost of those staff. And we didn't increase the business rates allocation by much other than more than the usual allocation in the budget guidance, but we allowed a drawdown from the Mayoral Development Corporation Reserve to top that up on the basis that when they started to acquire assets, they would capitalise as much of the costs of those additional delivery people within the realms of what's allowable in accounting standards, and pay the MDC back for some of that some of that drawdown. So that's a 2-year deal. That's what they asked for. That's what we put on the table. We said, let's see how you get on with that, develop the business case, push it through government, and as your organisation starts to sort of take off into the next stage, we'll talk again. So it's got to be done in the round. And we're not in the business of approving sort of empire building and to give them lots of more money than we think would be justified. So that dealt with the resourcing aspect of it. They then, obviously, in parallel to that, need to acquire some land. So we gave them some land from the Mayor's Land Fund. And at the same time, they also, I forgot what it's called now. There was some money available from Dulux, and they bid for that, and they got another £54 million for that. So they've got £104 million that they told you yesterday, which is available to acquire some of the land to do the land assembly, and then the people that they've got, which I think this year gives them about 11 million-ish, 11.7 if I can remember right, to make that happen. They also applied for some money for a district heat network, and we gave them some money from the 90 million climate budget money to help them to develop their business case, which then attracted another £35 million of DESNES money. So they got that as well. So they're moving from being a tiny outfit to a slightly bigger outfit, and we're working with them. So they're recruiting a new CFO, who's the guy that came yesterday. They've advertised the job permanently, so they're doing that. David's growing his executive team, and they work with us, and we talk to them on a monthly basis. But so the budget process is very straightforward from the team's perspective, and then we look at it on a business case basis for the additional bits around how they use the money. Most of it, of what they're planning on doing, is public sector land, which should be transferred to them from Network Rail, Department for Transport, and other public sector organisations, which is different from the model they tried to do a few years back, which was trying to acquire the Cardrant land. So I think there's some lessons learned there from the past. Good team, good business cases, a much more professional way of approaching what they're asking for that's substantiated.
Okay, thank you. So I mean, you mentioned the land assembly work they're doing and the heat network they're trying to develop. That's £141 million capital programme over 2 years from where they had nothing before. You're happy that that's realistic?
Yeah, because it's not... Let's park the district heat network for just a second. The land assembly is realistic on the assumption that they negotiate the deal, they buy the land, and it happens. So, subject to the legals talking, then David assures us that that money will be out of the door because they know what they want to buy. And again, being careful about not revealing individual price values. They know what they're trying to buy through CPOs, and so that is okay. The district heat network, I don't think they can build that in 2 years. I think that's a much longer term, and I don't think he said that yesterday either. I think what they're saying is that will go through subject through planning permission and design and etc. But they've got that money secured on the basis that they deliver what they said they're going to do.
Okay, excellent. That's all for me. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Assembly Member Russell.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on the district heat network because obviously that is incredibly risky. We've seen the LLDC residents saddled with sort of exorbitant costs for their controlled heat and power district heat network. And I just wondered what kind of governance is in place to ensure that the district heat network is resilient to changes in energy markets, to and you know, because we talked last year when we were talking with LLDC, you know, they've got their data centres where they could be getting heat from. They could be doing ground source heat if they're doing complete new build of, you know, big areas of land. So yes, so I suppose my question is, what are the governance processes that you've got in place to make sure that the district heat network delivers good outcomes? Because it's not just about building a heat network, it's making sure that the heat they provide is affordable into the future for those people living in those homes or in those business buildings.
A really good question, but one where I think the answer is probably not, I'm not the best person to answer it because I helped them to get the money to develop the business case and to get the money from DESNZ. I'm assuming that there's a governance regime in place with DESNZ on that in order to show how they're using the money and what it's achieving, but also that their internal governance arrangements in OPDC will also be monitoring what they're doing with that project. And then from a GLA oversight point of view, I'm assuming that the Good Growth team under Phil Graham's direction is also putting certain governance arrangements into place from an environmental perspective. So I haven't thought beyond that because I've really wanted to see that it's going to take off, and we've got time to put things into place. I don't compare it completely to the LLDC one because when they first came to ask for the money for that one, people were using the LLDC one as, is this really what we want to do? But at the time, the folks who were developing that business case actually really made the argument that it was a very different, much more modern way of approaching a district heat network, and not to be discouraged by the label on the box, but to say, actually, this is a very 21st century way of approaching this. So I think
it's about the resilience for the future, isn't it? Because
exactly.
Circumstances change. When that combined heat and power network was put in LLDC, it was shiny new technology. Everyone thought it was resilient for the future, and then all the circumstances changed. The energy prices went massively up, and they were reliant on gas, I think, and that left them with a project that, you know, everyone on the LLDC site is signed up to get their heat from it, and it's horribly expensive. And it's making sure that we've got the, how long will the data centres continue to produce the heat?
That's a good
Do
point.
they need to do they need to build in future resilience so that they've got another source of heat as well, e.g. ground source or something else? But there's a huge making sure that it's future proof is really important, particularly when we're living in such volatile economic times.
I totally agree with you. I just think it might be probably better to come from the Environment Committee than this one.
Can we make sure we follow that up as we go through the process?
We definitely can. I have to say, I'm very pleased that you brought it up. We've had issues, in Sutton with the district heat network. Actually, not just cost, reliability is another issue. You're stuck with this thing, and if it doesn't work, you have no heating. And yes, for there's like 700 properties on that development in Sutton. And so my background is in technology. I'm very used to technology people coming along and telling me that they have this thing that's the latest, greatest, wonderful, shiny thing that turns out to be quite like the similar previous thing that didn't work very well. So I'm very happy to follow up on that. I don't see any other indications, so thank you very much to our guests this morning. Thank you, Enver. Thank you, Elliott. That sort of concludes our main business. We've got a couple of bits of housekeeping, but you're free to leave and continue with your day. Thank you very much, gents. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion this morning? And can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the ongoing and closed actions from previous meetings of the committee? Action taken under delegated authority. Can I ask the committee to note the recent action taken by the chairman of the budget? I don't know why I have to refer to myself in the third person. Under delegated authority, following consultation with the party group lead members, namely to agree the committee's letter to the Mayor of London regarding the draft GLA Mayor Budget 24-25 as attached at Appendix 1. Good. 6. Can I ask the committee to note our work programme and meeting dates? On which point the date of the next meeting is the 19th of December 2023 at 10 a.m. in the chamber here in City Hall. I have no urgent business today, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everyone.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater